Drafted Luck, Book 5 of the Twisted Luck series. Written by Mel Todd. Narrated by Autumn Juliet. To all the people that helped make this book a reality. Doug, Ginger, Seska, Michelle, Marcus, Marguerite, Monica, Marcia, and so many others. Thank you. Chapter 1. Mandatory Mage Registration and Service Act, Section 1.1. All mages are required to be tested and ranked by their 27th birthday. At that time, they will be assigned a rank of Hedge Mage, Magician, Wizard, Archmage, or Merlin. Hedge mages are regarded as normal, in most cases, and are not faced with the burden placed on other mages. I wheeled my suitcase down the dingy hallway on the 3rd floor. The linoleum looked older than me. Each side of the hallway had small doors leering at me, some with a name written on a sticky pad stuck to them. My fellow draftee mates, I assumed. All mages were required to serve in the draft, and being a Merlin, my service was a decade long. Odds were most of the others would only have a 4-year draft. Lucky them. I kept walking the interminable hall, searching for my name, Corisande Monroe. As I went, the dim fluorescent lights and lack of windows doing nothing to assist me. Gauging the distance between the doors, I figured each room would be about the size of my closet. Well, the size of Sable and Joe's closet. Joe, my best friend in the world, and her spouse, Sable, wouldn't be able to get all their clothes in something this small. Good thing that wasn't one of my foibles. And I missed them already, which seemed vaguely silly. I might be gone for the next decade. Why was I missing them barely hours into the next act in my life? Because you are joined and miss them? I twisted the ring on my right finger at the thought, the magical stone brighter than it had any right to be.
I do not understand why we must stay here,
Carelian protested as he walked by my side.
Sable and Joe did not need to leave their home for their orientation. Why do you?
I fought back a sigh. My familiar was a Cath, a species of intelligent cat-like beings that lived in the Chaos realm. Cath did not believe human rules applied to them. Carelian often refused to understand why I had to follow laws, or rules, or orders, or a myriad of other restrictions when he had a much simpler solution. Usually kill them, eat them, or do it anyway. Caths were the ultimate example of, that can't possibly apply to me, creatures. Because it is a new process that started this round, the email mentioned something about networking and an environment with less distractions. Besides, it's only a month, and who knows where I'll be placed when this orientation is done. It could be anywhere. I really hoped it was Atlanta. I'd lived there for the last 5 years with Joe and Sable, but the government could and would place you anywhere in the world if they had a need. And given my power and access to multiple branches of magic, they might decide they needed me everywhere or anywhere. Carelian, who'd grown to the size of a large St. Bernard, was less fuzzy, rumbled by my side, his tail swishing as we stopped in front of a door with my name tacked to it. I pushed it open and glanced inside, fighting back a sigh. I'd become spoiled in my accommodations the last few years. This room looked like a reject from the 70s. Twin bed, desk, tiny closet with a built-in dresser that might hold my clothes. The air conditioner/heater combo was built into the wall under the window. When I added in the linoleum that hadn't been changed this century and the vaguely harvest gold faded paint, I almost expected bell-bottoms and a disco ball to materialize. 1 month. We can handle it, I said, trying to convince myself more than him.
I prefer the accommodations at our apartment,
he groused, walking into the room and inspecting every inch. You prefer the house in Albany with your own bed and a yard to go terrorize squirrels in," I retorted, but I didn't really disagree with him. Sable's job paid her over $100,000 a year. With the addition of our rent allowances for college, we had gotten a nice apartment for the three of us, with double master bedrooms and only a 15-minute walk to school for Joe and me. But that was in Atlanta. I'd inherited a house in Albany, New York, that all of us loved. But at this rate, it would be another decade before I could live there. Joe earned her bachelor's, then her master's in mechanical engineering, with a minor in transform, and the draft had slapped her to work with the Army Corps of Engineers on some water rights stuff with Lake Lanier. She seemed happy and excited about what they were doing, even if half of what she and Sable talked about went over my head. It took me another 2 years to get my doctorate. I spent a lot of time in labs, and my dissertation ruffled a lot of feathers. But it meant Sable would be finished with her service next year. She loved her current job, and they had hinted at a promotion, but already headhunters were talking about some great jobs all over the country. I had no idea that an interest in water purification could be so lucrative. But for now, she'd chosen Atlanta. Where they might decide to go depended a lot on where I ended up. Joe and Sable had gotten married this summer, between my graduation and the start of my draft, though Joe had proposed at the 4th of July. What I hadn't expected was that they had been talking to Esmir and Baignarl about triads. When they married me in the same ceremony, I thought my heart would break with joy and fear. But I also knew those two were in my life forever. They had talked about having children when both of them were done with the draft, and we were all settled. We were still working on what a triad meant to us. I didn't know what we were besides family. Carelian and his mother, or Malk and Esmir, said we were adjoining, and that was all that mattered. The relationship between the three of us wasn't sexual, but it was real. I had finally realized it would never break, and adding Sable had just made it stronger, though I still didn't know what making us into a coven would involve. But now that I had finished my doctorate, it was my turn to serve. I loved what I'd learned, though I wasn't sure what job they would assign me. Being a double Merlin, the only one they'd identified so far, meant I was overly powerful. Then, if you added in Carelian, it meant I had even more power at my disposal. This power made a lot of people very nervous. I'd earned my bachelor's in biology, master's in biology, and doctorate in quantitative biosciences. It meant I was really excellent at researching things in labs, and maybe even coming up with new medicines or procedures. At least, that was my hope. I had a ton of minors, too. Mostly, I'd had time to kill and free tuition, so why not learn everything I could? I'd earned minors in spirit, chaos, organic chemistry, and criminal justice. Steve Alexant, my mentor, sometimes boss, almost friend, and fellow Merlin, thought they might use me as a troubleshooter because I had worked with the FBI and had the CJ minor. Personally, I counted the decade off my draft all as penance for my degrees and just wanted to get it over with. The last few years had been quiet, with no one trying to kill me, pressure me, or even give me any hassle. Apparently, the last big drama, after I got my degree, with actual demigods from the other realms showing up, convinced everyone to leave me alone. It had been nice. Either way, I had regular classes with Baignarl, my Griffin teacher, though we'd moved on to theoretical discussions and talk about how our scientific explanation of magic compared to how realm denizens thought about magic. Those discussions had dropped down to once a month and would only go on hold until my draft settled down. The three of us usually made it a day out with friends, bringing food and other things from our realm. We'd started a spice trade that had made us a bit of extra cash and guaranteed I'd at least be able to pay my membership in the House of Emrys, by that alone. Though getting gems exchanged into cash was a pain sometimes. A quick glance at my watch told me I had 30 minutes until the start of orientation. I unpacked quickly. dumping my first aid kit and bathing supplies on the shelf in the closet. It didn't take me long to locate the shared bathrooms or the laundry room. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and sent Joe and Sable a quick text. Am here, unpacked, off to hear the lecture about my solemn duty. Almost instantly, there was a laughing emoji. We didn't go silent. You never knew when someone would kidnap you. Too bad we had to learn that the hard way when Hamadia, my house, had kidnapped both of them. Enjoy! Being as one bored. Still don't understand why they're keeping you there, but whatever. Don't eat anyone. Joe texted back. I pretended she meant that for Carelian, as I was much too nice of a dragon to ever eat anyone. Besides, for me, being a dragon was a state of mind, not a form I could shift into. Shape-shifting wasn't a magic any human had. I laughed to myself as I had a nightshirt that read, "Don't poke dragons, for you are crunchy and taste good with ketchup." With one last look around the room, I headed to the orientation location. Carelian trailed alongside me, too bored to even chase leaves. It looked like we were on the campus of a small college built ages ago. There were small signs printed up saying orientation with an arrow, and I followed, surprised I hadn't run into anyone yet. Sable said her orientation class, which had met daily for 2 weeks to make sure they knew the laws, how pay worked, and who to complain to if they had an issue, had over 200 people and was more of a seminar class than anything else, complete with homework. I glanced at the cat by my side. He'd been too quiet, and that usually meant he was up to something. You don't have to stay. You can go sleep at the apartment, or even the house if you want. Carelian could step through reality to any place he wanted, though I didn't know if all Cath could do that, or if it was a learned skill. I could sidestep to anywhere on Earth if I could visualize it clearly enough. I wasn't crazy enough to try to sidestep from here to another realm. Within realms, I could sidestep if I knew where it was stepping to, but so far, I'd refused to do anything quite that insane outside of binaural space. Realms could be anything and could shift. Earth remained stable.
No, my queen, I stay by your side.
He almost muttered the words. If I hadn't been walking down the aisle to the front of the auditorium, I might have pushed him on it. As it was, I was too busy frowning. It was an auditorium, but in front of the stage were 11 chairs, obviously waiting for people to fill them. I had no idea if they were for the other mages here for orientation, or if it was for someone else. Except they all faced the stage, not the audience. I moved over to the side, scanning the auditorium with both my eyes and my magic. I could sense magic if someone else was casting a spell or tearing open a portal to another plane. But I didn't sense any magic or portals opening. It felt like a building, nothing more or less. Carelian had disappeared into the shadows, of which there were more than I would have thought. Did no one believe in turning on lights? I didn't see Carelian. Not that I was particularly worried about him, but he'd been known to give people heart attacks in sheer fright when they saw him. A light flashed into the auditorium as someone else opened the door. I looked up the aisle to see who was arriving. The lack of good light, not to mention the door opening again, prevented me from getting a clear look. I knew they were people, and that was it. I rolled my shoulders and brushed down my pants. Today, I was dressed in my nice but powerful clothes. Jean slacks, a soft green tank top, and a lightweight jacket in gray matching my slacks, with interior pockets. That paired with low-heeled boots and my hair in a smooth braid, I knew I looked a bit remote and older than I was, which was the intent of this outfit. Over the years, I'd learned just how powerful clothing could be. When the newcomers got closer, I frowned, more than a bit surprised. Mages, well, most mages, didn't emerge until after puberty. At a minimum, you had to get a bachelor's, but most got masters or even doctorates like me. That meant most mages were in their mid to late 20s when they started their draft. I was a bit old at earning my doctorate at 27. Most people were out by 25 or so. The group of people walking down struck me as odd. At least 2 had tattoos on their faces, besides their mage tattoo. Their clothes were beat up or screamed attitude, and a few were much younger than me, maybe only 22, which I guessed was possible, but it seemed off. I'd been a college student. We had this self-possession, almost arrogance, especially in the later years as we got used to magic and its limitations. These mages didn't look anything like that, and it made me uncomfortable.
Yo, looks like we got primo seats. What's up?
Said one of the men. His skin either a light tan or the lights were worse in here than I thought. He flashed a grin that I'm sure was supposed to be charming, but it came across as wolfish and hungry. Waiting for orientation to begin, I replied, not sure about anything. I still didn't know where Carelian was or what he was up to.
Same. Should be badass. Get our draft done and make some sweet moolah. Can't wait.
He just smiled that same hungry smile, and I nodded, scanning the others. A mix of men and women. 1 or 2 looked interested in the setup. The others just looked as if here was the last place they wanted to be. I couldn't disagree with that sentiment. Before I could move over and try to introduce myself, sharp footsteps rapped out on the stage. A figure moved out into the light that hit the center front. The man was dressed in a navy 3-piece suit, with wing-tip shoes, his hair in a short, neat office cut. He strode out and drew our attention with a level of presence I couldn't help but admire. He stood, and I felt his gaze ruffle over us, though I couldn't see any details about his eyes.
I would say welcome, but you aren't. You're here because it is my job to make sure you can become productive members of society, or to make sure society never has to deal with you again.
Chapter 2, Section 115.2.4. During any mage draft service, security may prove paramount and electronic devices are at risk of being compromised. Any reasonable request to confiscate or limit access to electronic devices by either your draft contact or your draft supervisor will be supported. Refusal may be regarded as a national security matter.
Wait, what?
All of my attention snapped to him, and tweaks of discomfort in my stomach flared into full-blown churning.
Take a seat, now!
His voice rang through the room like a shot. 4 years ago, I would have been scrambling for a seat. 2 years ago, I might have ducked my head and slunk over there. But I'd practiced channeling my inner dragon. I watched the others scurry, eyes wide or snarl on their faces. The one that worried me the most was a girl with strawberry blonde hair. She didn't even seem to register anything he said, just drifted over and sat. I couldn't see her clearly, but something tugged at me. The only chair left was in the middle, front row, of course. I followed over at a slow, measured pace and sank into the chair, trying to emulate the grace Lucille Blanding exuded. Lucille managed James Wells' estate. While she kept everything ready for me to inherit, she also ran her own business and intimidated everyone who knew her. I talked to her and Indira Humbert, my other mentor, and Merlin, into giving me attitude and poise lessons. Carelian approved. He felt his queen should be more regal. I still wasn't sure I could pull it off, but now seemed the perfect time to put everything to use. Legs crossed, I tilted my head up, giving him my serene expression. I admired how he used height, light, and the auditorium to give him an illusion of power. But the question was, to impress or cow? From his statement, I was thinking cow, but the other people here didn't make any sense. Sable said she was with all archmages, as was Joe. There wasn't another Merlin here, and while I wasn't perfect at guessing, Almost none of these mages felt that powerful.
All of you are screw-ups and represent a danger to our great country. I am authorized to make sure you understand your responsibilities as a mage, or make sure you will never be a risk to anyone ever again.
The male mage who had spoken to me sneered and called out,
What are you gonna do to us? You ain't no mage. You're nothing.
He grinned maliciously as his words rang in the auditorium. Flames blossomed over his fingers.
Ricardo Everest.
The man on the stage didn't seem worried at all. He walked around the steps on the side and proceeded down the slow, ponderous steps. Lieutenant in the California Kings, never convicted of anything, but suspected in multiple crimes, any of which carried the death penalty. He kept speaking as he walked, stopping in front of Ricardo. Up close, I could see his hard face, with no laugh lines anywhere on it.
You got that right. No crime, no punishment.
Ricardo laughed as the flames created flickering light around his face.
That is how the law works. But if I was to do this...
The man swung at Ricardo, a hard, fast jab aimed at his chin. It never connected. Ricardo leaned back, then spun out of the way, standing, his face suffused in a scowl of rage. Our speaker stood there, a silent smirk on his face.
You stupid pendejo!
Ricardo spat, and fire jetted out toward the man before I could even react. But rather than being scared, the man sidestepped the flames and drew a gun. The movement so smooth and fast I didn't realize he had a gun in his hand until I heard him speaking.
Pursuant to Section 1.3.4, attacking an officer of the draft is a Class A felony and the punishment is death.
He pulled the trigger, and a dart slammed out and hit Ricardo in the neck. Ricardo gasped, his hand flying to his neck, eyes wide, face pale. Then, in a slow crumple like an ash remnant, he collapsed. Two men emerged from the shadows and headed toward us. All of it happened before I could even think to react. I watched it all with my mind frozen in surprise. The man turned and looked at us, and I saw the smirk at the corner of his lips.
Take this as a given. If you break the rules, the consequences will be severe and immediate. It is my job to make sure all of you know exactly what your role is as a drafted mage. Any breaking of the rules will be noted and addressed.
He glanced over to where the two men were carting Ricardo off.
He will be tried and executed. Everything here is videotaped and nothing is done without us being aware of it.
You killed him? Gasped out one of the women, dressed in a long bohemian gown with lots of crystals. Her neck was whiter than the quartz around her neck.
That would be inefficient and create extra paperwork. I hit him with a tranquilizer dart.
Lie. My mind shouted, though nothing else had been a lie.
He will go through due process like all of you will, because all of you are dangerous and don't know your place.
All of that was truth, though I knew I'd never see Ricardo breathing again. He scanned the assembled people, who all had pale faces.
Now that you understand your place, my job is to make sure you know the rules, and I will do everything legally in my power to make you cross the line. I delight in it. You know you are all losers, and I just plan on making sure you all are removed from the game legally.
He smirked right at me as he said that, and I felt everything snap into place. 3 years they'd been planning this, and I was the reason. They didn't think they could control me, so they planned on killing me legally, and starting the draft activated the draft laws. It gave them power over me they didn't have before. I narrowed my eyes, but settled back into my chair. A smile pasted on my lips. I knew every law regarding mages, each section and the history of it. Joe, Sable, and I had studied every loophole, and I knew this was a game of me keeping my cool. Carelian, want to join me? I asked, still smiling at the man.
I thought you never ask.
He purred and stalked out of the shadows. I heard a few muffled shrieks as he came up and sat next to me, and I couldn't blame them. I smiled at the man, keeping my calm, cool facade.
Oh yes, Marilyn Monroe. I was warned about your familiar,
he said with a flat tone.
Be warned. Any law you break, the consequences apply to it, too.
That made me laugh, and I could see multiple people looking at me, eyes wide. Sure, I was insane. You are welcome to try, but remember, he is his own person, and the second I die, there are no more restraints on him. I blessed Baynor and Esmere for the hours upon hours of political coaching they had provided me, pointing out that people would threaten Carelian to get to me. But they also pointed out that nothing short of a blitz attack or an area attack would get him. And Tursane only mentioned me being killed legally. Esmere was perfectly capable of taking any revenge she wanted no matter how I died. The very fact that those beings had talked about retaliations on humans made me wonder what else the title Herald meant. But no one would say. Apparently, it was like saying I was invited to dinner. What that involved could mean absolutely anything. Up to and including I was being served as dinner. The man glared at me, and I smiled, letting my hand rest on Carelian's back. Silence was power. He glared at me for a moment longer, then stalked back toward the stage.
For the next month, you had better watch your step, because I will be watching yours. My name is Brian Kemp, Director for the Draft, and I will be overseeing your re-education to make sure you understand the importance of your role in our society.
I heard others shifting and muttering, the empty chair in our midst a reminder of what we were facing.
Now, turn over all your phones. Now!
His voice cracked through auditorium, and the others scrambled to pull out their phones. I went through the law in my head and sighed. Pulled out my phone slowly, and Camp moved toward me, a small bag in his hand.
Drop it here.
1 minute, I said, and saw him about to snarl something, but I cut it off with a sweet smile. After all, we want to make sure we maintain security, don't we? He opened and closed his mouth a few times, trying to come up with a retort. As he spluttered, I pulled up and wiped my phone. I had Joe and Sable's numbers memorized. As I finished wiping, I pulled my credit cards and ID out of the case. I powered it down and dropped it in the bag, forcing a smile. There you go. Carelian didn't move from my side as Camp sneered at me and moved to collect the rest of the phones. I sat back and forced myself to think. If I thought through everything they could possibly pull, nothing would surprise me. I watched the others and saw 2 of them crying as they dropped their phones in the soft bag. Who knew what secrets the phones might reveal? Which was why I'd wiped mine. No one needed to know who I trusted or relied on.
Is there a purpose behind this theater?
Carelian asked, yawning, showing off his teeth if anyone thought about moving closer. Isolation, I suspect, and the enemies I made when Hamadia tested me on behalf of magic having probably come home to roost. Hamadia was the dryad that was part of my house. She kidnapped Joe and Sable, and I had to go rescue them. To save them, I had to pass 3 trials. By the time I returned to Earth, I had a yard full of draft officers waiting for me. They were offended that I'd stepped out on a murder investigation. I'd managed to avoid being found in violation of the laws, but I also created an enemy that day, Director Harold Leafone. I'd kept tabs on him, and he had risen to deputy chairman for the draft board. The only position higher was chairman, and that was usually a senator. It meant he had a lot of power, but I'd been hoping he'd forgotten about me. Carelian snorted in my mind.
Like I would ever leave you. You will never be isolated while you have me.
They don't count you, but they think it removes Joe and Sable from me. I was worried, as all of this seemed to be geared toward me. Or maybe just those who weren't seen as following the party line enough. That idea set off too many alarm bells in my mind. The other mages had found their way back to their chairs, and all of them were sitting there on the edges of their seats, most looking frantic, though a few looked bored, and the redhead hadn't moved. I watched Camp drop the bag of phones on the stage, wincing a bit at the crashing noise they made. At least mine was in a good case, but still. Oh well, worst case, I'd get a new phone.
Now that you understand the seriousness of this, here is the agenda for the next month. You will learn the laws and your place in them and what your requirements are for the draft. Most of you owe the government 4 years. Monroe here owes us 10. I doubt any of you will finish your draft. You're all too stupid or too arrogant to live that long. But since we want to make sure that you remain healthy, we are trialing a mandatory physical education requirement. You will be showing up every morning outside for PT. This isn't optional. The first part of the afternoon will be spent reviewing the laws. Then you will go to training for how to use your skills as the government requires from you. You must prove you understand how the laws apply to you.
He paused and looked at all of us, contempt clear on his face.
Do you understand?
Of course, I replied as I looked at him. His gaze locked on my face, and he smiled. I knew without a doubt that this had been arranged specifically for me.
Then go get what you need. A notebook might be helpful. For the next month, you won't be allowed off campus. Remember, violations can be construed as intentional avoidance of draft mandates. Meals will be provided, starting with breakfast tomorrow morning.
With that, he disappeared into the shadows with our phones, leaving us to stew. Chapter 3, Section 1.3.4. Assault or offensive use of magic on any draft officer during draft service is regarded as a Class A felony, and if authorized by the draft board and the OMO, the officer may have the person executed immediately. The echoes of his steps hadn't finished fading away before I was up and headed out of the auditorium, my mind spinning. Everything, even the PT, came across as a trap and a reason to sanction us for not following instructions. No one mentioned PT in the assignment email, so I had no workout clothes available, much less sneakers to run in. My strides were brisk across the campus, but my mind still processed what had occurred in that auditorium. Why were these other mages being lumped in with me? While having a gang lieutenant who was a mage seemed like a terrible idea, things like that had to have happened before. Was this something that happened on a regular basis? I'd obviously gotten too complacent over the last 2 years. All I'd done was research and study. The biggest excitement was going to Bagnarls. I turned it over in my mind as I reached the dorms. Esmir once said everything was politics, and I had the bad feeling this was going to prove that. The first political decision I had to make friends or keep everyone away from me. I needed information, and I needed it fast. Of course, I also needed clothes, shoes, and more hair scrunchies. I scanned the room, but just because I didn't sense magic didn't mean there weren't electronic listening devices. I started inspecting the room. Overhearing me I could defeat, but cameras I needed to remove. 15 minutes later, I finished checking every bit of the room, and no camera. Carelian, can you open a rip to Joe and Sable? He had sprawled out on the bed, taking up the entire thing. I added a note to pull in his bed too, otherwise I'd be sleeping on the floor.
I figured you would need to talk to them.
There was a small spike of pain as the rip formed, and I quested out. It had taken me a while to get to the point that I could talk to Joe and Sable this way. In the beginning, I could just send thoughts to them, but they couldn't respond. After much practice with Bagnarl, we'd advanced to full mind speech as long as Carelian facilitated it. It had something to do with him as my focus, but he groomed his balls every time we asked about it and didn't reply. He could be a jerk when he wanted to be one. Joe? Sable? Got a minute? Hey, Corey, what's going on? Joe responded, and as always, my speech had a bit more flavor to it than verbal words. Her worry and curiosity coated the words like sugared candy. Sable? Yep, here too. We're getting dinner ready. Sable sounded more relaxed, but she had a go-with-the-flow attitude I admired. So, I need a few things. This whole setup reads as a trap, and I'm going to need to deal with it, or they are going to use it as a reason to kill me. What? The dual exclamations spiked into my brain, and I groaned as I sat down on the uncomfortable desk chair. The students in the 70s must not have had any sensations in their butts. Easy, please. Shouting like that makes me think Carelian decided to use my brain as a scratching post.
That would be useless. Scratching posts should pull against my nails, not give at their touch.
He sniffed, and I flicked a hand at him. There was a moment of silence, then Joe and Sable snickered. I think you just got dissed by your cat, Joe said, sounding much more relaxed. This is not a new thing, I muttered, glaring at Carelian, who was busy making sure every hair on his tail exhibited perfection. So, the draft board is playing games. I'm pretty sure they're trying to kill me in a way they don't think Tersane and Salastra will have an issue with. Other than that, I'm not sure what is going on. Granted, I'm also not sure Tersane and Salastra remember their threats. I stated as I rose and walked around the room.
They do. They talk to Esmir about you sometimes.
Carelian provided. That doesn't help me feel more secure. Either way, someone is trying to kill us, or use me, or both. But I'm not sure yet. I paced in the tiny room, already missing the bigger space of my bedroom at Sable's. Okay, none of that explains why you're talking to us via manspeak, Sable pointed out, and I sighed. The person heading this program collected our phones. I think they're trying to play the isolation card or make sure people can't check out what they're being told while in class. But they've forgotten how much people in my generation communicate via computers. Sure, no phone makes it annoying, but with a computer, I can talk to anyone. Maybe both. But either way, I need a list of things, and not having a phone or being able to leave campus makes it difficult. In theory, we're allowed off campus tonight, but I suspect there is a curfew he didn't bother to tell us about. Only you, Corey. Joe laughed, and it wrapped around the words in my mind. So, what do you need? A few things. I'm going to need exercise clothes and tennis shoes. If you can get those, I think my loving familiar would be willing to step over and get them for me.
Depends. Will they share dinner?
He asked, sitting up.
Chicken?
Yes, oh bottomless pit. We'll throw another one in the air fryer for you, Sable said, and I could hear the mental rolling of eyes. Carelian ate more than both of them put together. Be interesting to see if the draft board was ready for his food needs. Carelian purred in our shared mind link.
Yes, the crispy fat is delicious that way.
I'll get a bag put together for you, Joe responded. What else? I think we should set up a check-in. Carelian, if something happens to me, I need you to go to Joe and Sable and make sure they are safe. Please. That was my one big fear. That if I was targeted, Joe and Sable would be as well.
Always. They are my queens, too.
He rose and pursued his head stropping across my leg. I rubbed his ears just the way he liked, as I thought. Right now, I think that's it. They took my phone, though, so let Steven and Indira know. Otherwise, can you order me some pizza to deliver here? I don't want to leave campus and open myself up to other issues. Yep, address match up to what was on the email? Joe asked. Yes, or at least the rideshare had no issue finding the place. I looked around and didn't see a fridge, but food was an excellent icebreaker. Joe, can you triple the order? I want to see if I can at least make nice with the other mages. Not that I trust any of them right now, but I don't get everything that is going on. It feels like I'm in some weird movie plot with layers and layers of conspiracy. I groaned and sank back down on the uncomfortable chair. Oh yeah, I need a notebook and stuff. Heck, I might need my laptop and a printer if he's going to have us do homework. This is just ridiculous. The email said just show up with enough clothes for 2 weeks and be ready to network. Sable snickered in my mind. I'd be much more worried if it was anyone else, but this sort of stuff seems to follow you. Remember your stalker last year? Yes, finally had to call Charles and ask him to come convince the guy that I was involved with him. And our familiars were sex partners. I still can't believe the guy bought it. I shook my head, remembering the incident. Charles Wainscott and his familiar, Ericina, had become friends and occasionally came over. He was an odd personality, even by my standards. He thrived in the logic of order and loved his databases. I suspected he had the skill set and personality to be a black hat hacker if he wanted. Lucky for us, he found working for big corporations managing their data and security much more interesting, as well as being a white hat hacker for me occasionally. He didn't come on our visits to Bainjarl, but he'd been up to the house in Albany twice, and he and Bainjarl had some epic conversations about the nature of morality.
More Ericina informed him if he continued to discomfort her chosen mate, she would use him as food for her children.
Carelian said in our minds, and I turned to glare at him. She what? He just flicked an ear at me, not expanding on his comment. I sighed. No wonder Charles kept getting funny looks on his face. I bet she was telling him things. Oh, yeah, let him know what's going on, too. Never realized how dependent I was on my phone. No worries. Everyone that knows you knows us, too. Mommy will be annoyed, but I'm sure she'll expect a visit as soon as you get an assignment, Joe said, soothing my worries a bit. Isolation was an effective technique. If I couldn't talk to them, I might already be freaking out. Okay, get everything ready for Carelian, and I'll be here waiting for pizza. Add some chicken wings. I'm suddenly starving. 1 order for a dorm full of starving students placed. Should be there in about 45 minutes. I'll have your stuff ready in about 10, but since I know Carelian will want at least 2 chicken breasts, I'd be surprised if he's back before the pizza gets there. Joe sounded sure and calm, and that made me relax. They are safe. I got this. And I did. The last few years had been quiet, the stalker registering more as an annoyance than anything else. I only did minimal magic in classes, working with Bainjarl on the big things, and I'd gotten very good at giving offerings that were almost invisible. Blood, skin, hair on my legs, so anyone watching would think I almost never did any magic, which had been part of the plan originally, but then it became second nature. The problem was going to be making sure I didn't give them any reason to enact the laws against me. I smirked, almost looking forward to it. But worry still churned in my stomach. They had already proved how ruthless they were willing to be. Watch yourselves. I don't know if they're trying to use you against me, but I wouldn't be surprised by anything. We will. You make sure you return to us as you left. Sable sent me a mental hug, and I responded in kind, already missing them. See you, Gore. Have fun storming the castle. Joe's teasing ended the connection. I looked at Carelian, who had stepped off the bed and was stretching, taking up most of the available space. I should have asked for another room, just for you, I said with a smile.
This is distressingly small.
His voice dismissive. I opened my mouth, then slammed it shut as I remembered the possibility of someone listening in. What's wrong? You've been grouchy all day. He sat and stared at me, his green eyes the color of his mother's fur.
I've been edgy. Something is wrong. This being a trap almost relieves me, but I feel like there is a target on my back.
His fur rippled down his spine as if trying to dislodge something, and worry shot straight through my heart. Be careful. Even you can't prevent a bullet slamming into your skull. If I lost him... My mind stopped, and I took a deep breath. If they hurt you, I'll destroy them. It was said with calm, cold intensity, and I meant it. They could push me all they wanted, But if they took him from me, there was no words to describe what would happen. His ears laid back against his skull. Then he chuffed.
Good. My Malkin would assist as would Bainjarl. Even my littermates might step in.
He leaned into my hand, and I scratched his chin.
I would expect nothing less than vengeance should they take me from you in such a cowardly way.
There would be. Same if Joe or Sable were hurt. But do me a favor. Don't get hurt. I need you too much. He licked my hand, then a spike of pain as a rip formed, and he stepped to another realm. It sealed back up, leaving me there, alone. I sat for a while, letting my mind rummage through what little I knew. I don't think they realized what they had started. But I had become complacent, thinking I could be invisible and unnoticed. I stood and walked over to the mirror on the closet door and gazed at the image reflecting back. The tattoos on my temple, the mark of a mage, filled with more colors than anyone else, proved I'd never been invisible. Time to rattle some cages. Remind them that poking dragons is a stupid idea. Chapter 4. Section 1.105.1. All mages are required to undergo a draft orientation where the weight of their debt on society is to be fully explained, as well as the consequences of not bearing that weight. If any mage is regarded as lacking the ability to carry their burden, measures may be taken to ensure society is not at risk. By the time pizza arrived, I'd changed into jeans and a tank top. Summer in West Virginia, which is where this little orientation was located, tended to be hot and muggy, but I still looked nicer than I had before Indira Humbert educated me in using fashion as a weapon and armor. Indira Humbert was my mentor and my teacher for my first year at GA Match Tech. Over time, she had become a friend. As a Merlin, she understood all too well how easy it was to be used. She used her experiences as a cautionary tale, and I'd taken it to heart. But she also used her sexuality as a weapon, something I couldn't do. Using clothes to set up expectations and control reactions was something I'd grabbed and almost started to enjoy. Almost. I still lived in tanks and shorts when no one besides Joe and Sable would see me. I met the delivery guy at the door and accepted 3 large pizzas and 2 boxes of wings, the smells filling the hall with mouth-watering scents. I turned and headed into the common room. It was basic to the point of stripped. It did contain a long counter and a sink against the far wall, with a few tables and chairs that looked like they'd survived multiple generations of college students. To my delight, Joe had asked the pizza place to include paper plates and plastic utensils. The lemon pepper wings, my favorite, were calling to me, and I worked on getting a meat lover slice and a few wings. I settled down in a chair, facing the entrance to the room, and satisfied my hunger as I waited and listened. Carelian hadn't returned yet, which didn't worry me. He was probably getting spoiled by Sable. Joe tended to be more sarcastic and not as much of a pushover. Sable, on the other hand, spoiled him rotten, which he firmly believed was his due. The sound of a few doors opening, then closing, followed by footsteps on the stairs, reassured me my idea had merit. It took about 3 minutes, but one of the draftees walked into the room, followed by 2 others. The 3 of them were simultaneously together and apart as they drifted in. My pizza took the majority of my attention, but I still watched them as they tilted up their heads, letting the scent seduce them. One was dressed in something that I swore I'd seen in Halloween shops. The long, flowing black dress and the chaos symbols everywhere. The only thing missing was a black pointed hat. She had long brown hair with ragged ends, telling me her offering wasn't smooth, which was another giveaway. Almost everyone took the cosmetology course and learned how to use certain aspects for offering. Some of us learned a lot more, but then appearance was everything. Huh, that's an idea. Purposefully give up offerings like that in chunks. Make someone underestimate or think I'm awkward. My offerings were almost invisible, but it might be a good idea for misdirection. It was layer upon layer of subterfuge, but this was why my life had been about politics for the last few years, no matter how boring I thought they were. The other two were men, one looking like he belonged in a goth band, hair dyed black, the roots were a giveaway, with eyeliner that even rock stars didn't do, and white skin that made me wonder if he was allergic to the sun or layered in face paint. Even the tattoo of spirit on his face was in drab colors. The other one was about as opposite as you could get. Tall, muscular, a golden boy if I'd ever seen one. He had order on his temple and a smirk on his face. His clothes were of the same quality as what I wore out, so I pegged him as having either money or training. Most mages got paid well, but not usually until after the draft was over. Of course, he was the one making a straight path to me. I continued to watch, trying to figure out their roles here. The girl in emo, maybe I could see. But why was this guy one of the failures?
Hello, gorgeous. I ended up not thinking about the fact that all my cards were in my phone. You know how it is. Everything is cloud-based, which makes it difficult to get dinner tonight. Mind sharing your pizza, and next time, dinner's on me.
He had a brilliant smile, and I could almost believe his words. None of them were a lie, which was well done, but they didn't ring sincere. I figured people might need some food. Sure, help yourself, there's plenty. I included the other two hovering at the edges of the common room. That includes us? The Halloween refugee asked, eyeing the pizza. Sure does, but would you bring me another slice of the combo? I asked, watching as Golden Boy already had 3 pieces piled on his plate. The split-second indecision as he turned and had to decide where to sit was amusing. But I didn't react, just watched the others. He strutted over, and the image of a rooster in the yard jumped into my mind. I wonder if he'd look as silly running from Carelian as that bird had. My smile threatened to escape my control. I prevented that by taking another bite of pizza.
Since you were so gracious as to share your food, may I impose on your company also?
He asked. The other two were still pursuing the food options. Sure. I waved at the table. I'd made sure I had one of the bigger ones. It would comfortably sit 6. He settled down to my right, smiling at me. It was a very practiced smile, and I wanted to ask where he'd taken lessons from, but that might have been my own cynicism.
Benjamin Traynor, but all my friends call me Ben.
Oh, he was smooth. So why was he here with the losers? Corey Monroe, I replied as the other two approached.
Hi, can I, maybe sit here?
Emo Boy asked, his voice low and shoulders sagging, as if he already had processed my rejection. The girl peeked over his shoulder, like a cross between a scolded puppy and a hopeful toddler. Big table. Sit down. I'm sure you heard him, Corey. What are your names? I saw the flicker of disappointment cross Ben's face, but I pretended to ignore him. I needed to pry out their secrets. They settled in, and the girl's eyes flicked across all of us. She was so ridiculous, I couldn't help but think of her as a girl. Even as a teen, Jo had more presence before emerging than she had now.
I'm Neil,
the emo muttered, focusing on the food and not us. Hi, I'm Claudia. I'm a Wiccan, she offered. I fought back a sigh. Wiccans should have been exceptional with how the elementals worked, but they've lost sight of it every time by relating it to females only. As far as I'd been able to figure, magic had no gender, but most human languages didn't have neutral pronouns for sentient beings. And it just came across as rude. Even the denizens felt uncomfortable calling magic it. But while magic might be referred to as she, her domain didn't care what was between your legs.
Benjamin Traynor,
offered Ben again, though a lot less enthusiastically than he had to me. Everyone fell silent as they ate, and I tried to figure out how to ask why they were there. I had a criminal justice degree. I should be better at extracting information. Esmir would have already had them spilling their stories. She also had 5-inch claws. So, did any of you know the guy, Ricardo? I asked, watching them under my lashes. It wasn't hard to pretend the pizza and wings absorbed my attention. I was hungry.
No,
murmured Claudia.
Attacking a draft officer was stupid. What did he expect?
Ben said, his voice arrogant, and I did an internal wince. The lessons learned in the other realms had been seared into my brain. Neil shrugged, still not looking any of us in the face. While that annoyed me, he also wasn't concentrating on anything other than food.
Figured we're all dead. Isn't that what he said? Knew I'd end up like this.
Self-defeat colored every syllable out of his mouth, and I had to fight the urge to slap him. Instead, I pretended to be naive. What do you mean? Did you piss off the board? What could you have done? I mean, you've been in college. How much trouble can you get in? They don't go around killing people. Neil didn't answer. He shoved the remains of the pizza slice into his mouth, eyes down. I let my gaze drift over the others, a curious expression on my face.
No clue,
Ben said, a smile on his face, but my magic screamed lie.
I figured it's a clerical error. I'm not planning on getting into any trouble. Getting through the draft and get back to work.
That part was true. None of this made sense. Claudia shifted in her seat, a blush rising up her face. I might have been caught trading magic services for money, she said, her voice almost a whisper.
So?
I said, drawing out the vowel as I twisted that in my head. That's not illegal, as long as you report the income. She coughed. I might have been doing it for insurance claims. I flickered my gaze to the strong fire on her temple, and it clicked. You were doing arson for hire? Are you insane? At that point, I couldn't figure out why she hadn't been charged and executed already. Law enforcement didn't deal with arson nicely. She sighed. I'm not very good, and it only scorched the floor. The desire to beat my head on the table was spiking hard. I shot another glance at Ben, who was munching through pizza like he didn't have a care, but his leg was tapping out a rapid staccato. Neil?
I don't want to do college. Took early draft. Just going to teach me to keep me in control.
I tilted my head. He wasn't wrong, but it was more than that. And he'd raised his head as a person to watch. So yeah, they were going to hit him hard. We all fell silent and worked on food. I thought about talking to the others, but so far I only had a slight idea of what was going on and why they'd thrown me here. Claudia had finished her one piece, with all the meat picked off, when another guy walked in. He'd been one of the mages in the auditorium, but seated behind me. Very well built, and carried himself like an athlete, his skin somewhere between Joe and Sable's in tone. He had long dreads knotted in sections that I recognized as offering marks. An easy way to make it fast to offer. I'd used it myself.
Yo, who ordered the pizza?
He asked, even as he headed toward it. I did, and feel free to help yourself, I said, amused.
I will,
he retorted over his shoulder, flashing a smile that Claudia went all gooey at. A minute later, he strutted over, flipped a chair around, straddling it.
Well, I see two sexy women. I'm sure we'll have lots of time for fun later. It's rad they're including PT as part of the draft training. After all, a fit body is necessary for a healthy mind. I'm Dwayne Jordan.
Neil and Ben were looking at him with matching sneers. I had to avoid laughing at the reactions. I doubt we'll have much time for fun, but we're discussing the comments made by Camp at the orientation. I probed, wanting to see what he'd say.
Merlin cares.
It was the popular dismissal lately. I thought it was stupid.
That'll get me out of this in a week or so. There's no reason for me to be here, and I've got some sweet ladies to get back to.
The conversation died, and the others left after eating most of the pizza. I sat and thought, but couldn't come up with any more ideas. Just lots of concerns. Carelian lounged on the floor of the room when I returned, and the scent of chicken filled the air. "Have a good dinner?" I asked as I grabbed the 2 bags on the floor. One bag contained my school backpack, which had my laptop and notebooks in it. I pulled that out and set it on the desk, checking to make sure I didn't lack anything important, like power cords or mouse. But everything was there as I expected.
It was excellent. Chicken is a wonderful meat. Not as good as salmon, but still delicious.
I had pizza. It was decent. I didn't even try to make him feel guilty. It did no good. I switched to mind speech, just in case. "So, did you get any of your concerns dealt with?" He yawned widely. I just stared at him.
It still feels like an ambush, and I cannot see the trap. Esmir agrees it is targeted at you, but it is being used to clean up other loose ends.
I agree. I figured out 1 or 2 of the loose ends, but not all of them. Why are they here? Or what did they do to piss off everyone? I put everything away and got ready for bed. I suspected someone would be banging on my door at 5 a.m. "Ah, coffee!" I turned, looking around the room. Not even a cheap pod coffee maker. Oh, this is cruel and unusual punishment. No coffee? Chapter 5. Section 20.21. Upon injury, excluding situations where providing aid would put others at risk, no person involved in the draft may be denied medical aid. All mages' injuries or illnesses should be tended immediately by qualified medical personnel to prevent risk to their own selves and others. I staggered up as my alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. The idea of sending Carelian to get me coffee presented an almost overwhelming temptation, but I resisted. He had elected to sleep at the house in Albany, which I couldn't blame him for. The small room would have required him to sleep on the floor, which was only acceptable when he decided to do that. It also prevented me from stepping on him when I rolled out of bed that morning. 15 minutes later, I had sweats, a sports bra, t-shirt, and sneakers on. Sure enough, at 4:50, there was a pounding on the door down the hall.
"Time to get up! Daylights is wasting. Get your asses in gear!"
The yelling voice didn't sound like camp, and I would have been surprised if he lowered himself to work out with us. I opened the door before the wannabe drill instructor could hammer on it. The man standing right outside my door sneered at me.
"Glad to see someone knows how to get up in the morning. You might make it after all."
The man was a few inches taller than my 5'6" and weighed double what I did, and all of it was muscle. He had his skull shaved and hard, light blue eyes. Those same eyes raked me up and down, then spun, marching to the next door that presumably contained a mage.
"Outside and lined up. You have 5 minutes."
I made my way downstairs, still wishing desperately for coffee. Dwayne Jordan was already outside, looking overly peppy and enthusiastic. I began to stretch a bit, wary about what was planned. As I warmed up, I positioned myself to see who made it down the stairs. Claudia showed up, dressed in a tank top and shorts and sandals. At least they looked rugged, but I still suspected they would be less comfortable than real sneakers. Ben dragged himself down, yawning, in a pair of jeans and polo shirt, and I cringed, but mostly I wanted to scope out the others. The redhead came out wearing the same sundress she had yesterday, and strappy sandals that didn't look like they'd survive any amount of hard use. Neil followed her, surprisingly dressed in black sweats, shirt, and tennis shoes. I tried to think of the 4 that were missing. The instructor bellowed, and I saw 3 people scurrying down and 1 sauntering. The saunter belonged to a pretty woman with ebony skin and cheekbones that would make a model sigh with envy. Though she wore so much makeup it looked caked on her face. The tights she wore left nothing to the imagination, especially when paired with the bra clearly visible under her loose tank top. At least she wore shoes that looked possible to run in. The other three just looked out of place. A dark-haired woman wore clothes at least 2 sizes too big for her, and her hands just shook as she stood there. Another male, Chinese I thought, had no expression on his face. While he wore exercise clothes, they reminded me of what you got issued in high school. They had no personality. The last made me sigh. Skinny, with horrible acne, glasses, and braces. His eyes were locked on the ass of the spandex wearer, and given the light pants he wore, the effect she was having on him was obvious. He came across as a stereotypical, oversexed nerd. That thought made me stop, and I looked at them. Most mages were college graduates. We'd learned how to interact with people. Even Charles could be polite if he thought it was worth the effort. Out of this group, not counting myself, at least 3, if not 4, were obviously not versed in being social. This is a rigged setup, and it's too obvious. So who here is a ringer? All of them? The only person I could be sure of was me. This got more twisted with every piece of information I got. The desire to call for Carelian flashed through my mind, but I didn't need to have him antagonize everyone, and he would for sheer amusement factor. There was still the redhead and someone else missing.
Line up single file. I'm York Beecham. You may call me Sarge or Beecham. I've been hired to make sure you wimps can handle the field. We're going to start off with a nice run and see how many of you can't hack the left you'll be leading.
He looked at the get-ups a few others were wearing and sneered.
And how many of you will be running back to mommy?
Oh, if only that was an option. My internal sarcasm levels were high, and all I wanted to do was find coffee and go back to bed. The order didn't matter.
Let's go, mages!
He barked and gestured for us to head out. We started in a slow line with only Dwayne looking at all enthusiastic. York proved he kept himself in excellent shape by circling around us and yelling at anyone who lagged. I don't know what he said, but it motivated the person he chewed out as they picked up their pace. I saw a flash of red at the end of the line and figured it was the missing girl. Joe had insisted I get in shape, and after my first 6 months of college with multiple people trying to kill me, I'd realized it was a very good idea. I would never enjoy working out. In fact, it sucked. That being said, I'd still spent a lot of time on treadmills, Stairmasters, ellipticals, and weight machines. Joe was much more fit than I, but I'd gotten to a nice maintenance level where I had muscle without looking buff. The pace that York set equaled a slow jog compared to what I normally did. I wanted to pick up the pace just to get it done as soon as possible. At the rate we were going, it would take an hour plus to cover the distance, which annoyed the daylights out of me. Not that I had anything in particular I needed to go do, but still, I wanted to be done with this getting sweaty crap. The path was headed back to our dorms, and I sighed in relief. A shower and hopefully food where there would be coffee would be excellent. He pulled us to a stop and didn't even look winded. Being near the beginning of his little line, Dwayne had been ahead of me. I hadn't been able to see how the others were holding up. Now I could turn and look at them, and I froze. Most of them were fine, if exhausted and looking like they were about to drop. Claudia was limping badly from her shoes. They hadn't been made for running like I thought. The redhead, however, had blood trailing behind her at each step as she sniffled. My desire to support this farce snapped, and I was at her side, ignoring Beecham. "Sit down." I snapped out the command, even as I helped her to the ground.
"What do you think you're doing?"
yelled York, looking like he was about to get into my face. "Helping her, per section 20.21. I'm providing medical assistance." I didn't bother to yell. He wasn't as important as her feet. At some point, the strappy sandals had fallen off, or been discarded, but she'd continued to run. Why? Her feet were shredded with bits of rocks and twigs in them. Why the hell wasn't she screaming or crying?
Section.
He stumbled, and I heard flipping. I glanced away from her feet to figure out what he was doing. He had a small book in his hand and was flipping through it. I saw the word laws on the front. I shifted my attention from her feet, which, while oozing blood, weren't life-threatening, to her face. And I wanted to be sick. In the dim auditorium, I hadn't really seen her. The shifting lights and the little display from camp had ensured I'd focused on him, not the others. The epicanthic folds at the corner of her eyes, the sweet smile, face streaked with tears of pain, told me everything I needed to know.
Section 20.21. Injured mages are to be treated by qualified medical personnel.
He stressed the word qualified and tried to sound menacing. It didn't even register as I looked at a mage with Down syndrome. I knew the stats. It was covered in one of the basic mage laws courses. Less than 1 in 10,000 mages had birth defects, or disabilities that could not be overcome, like dyslexia. The teacher never said what was done with those mages who couldn't use magic, and I had too much going on to follow up on a question of statistical curiosity. Now, that statistical anomaly looked at me and smiled. I am a qualified and registered paramedic.
In Georgia,
he growled, as if proud of his comeback. And Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, and West Virginia. I made sure to get licensed in all those states. I looked up at him. Now explain to me why I have a patient with Down syndrome bleeding. There was no compromising in my voice, and I didn't care. Here, I was in the right, and he knew it. Something akin to shame flickered over his face before he stiffened.
I'll call for medical. Keep her contained until then.
He pivoted and headed away from us. I didn't bother to watch him go. Instead, moved my attention to my patient. Hey, I'm Corey. Do you know your name? Her smile widened, even if her lips trembled a bit, and she nodded her head. Can you tell me your name? Bridget. I'm Bridget. You had a cat. Her voice was sweet and guileless. I wanted to cry and scream. I did. Would you like to pet him while I work on cleaning up your feet? Her eyes sparkled, and she sniffed up a trail of snot leaking down her face. Yes. Carelian, can you bring me my med kit and come outside, please? I have someone that would like to pet you. He must have heard something in my voice. I enjoy pets. I needed saline to clean out her wounds, but most of my mind was locked in a vicious cycle of trying to figure out what to do. The law didn't make allowances for mental capabilities, only hospitalization, and her feet would be easy enough to treat, though normal medical advice would be to stay off of them until healed. The sound of multiple gasps had me lifting my head and looking at the other mages. They had gathered around me before I'd seen their mixed looks of pity and horror. Right now, they weren't looking at Bridget, or me. They were focused on the dorms. Sitting on the ground, I peered through their legs and smiled. Here he comes. He loves to be petted, and his ears scratched. I felt more than heard the rustle of people getting out of Carelian's way as he parted the group. Medkit. What happened? He growled out as he looked at her torn-up feet. This is one of those instances where your mother and I would have a difference of opinion. I sent him as I dug into the kit. Bridget, this is Carelian, my familiar. You want to pet him? Her eyes were wide as she looked at him, and I couldn't blame her. He probably weighed about what she did. He bite? No, he won't bite you. That I could say with 100% certainty. Carelian lay down next to her so she could easily pet him, and she did. Her slow, awkward movements were all gross motor control and almost no fine. How did I miss what she was? The problem was I knew how I'd miss this. I was focused on the person orchestrating this, and unsure if the others were allies or opponents. But that meant I'd miss the innocent they'd put in here. Offering to the wolves? I didn't know, and I could hear Carelian's purr as she carefully petted him. I had her feet clean and bandaged by the time York came back. The man had lost what little respect I might have had for him with this stunt.
"The ambulance is coming, and they'll take her to get fixed up,"
he barked out. I nodded. "I'll catch up when they take custody of her." He started to protest, and I gave him a flat stare. I am obligated to stay with my patient until someone else takes charge. You wouldn't want me to break the law, would you? He snapped his teeth shut and turned to the others.
"The PT is cut short today. If you don't have the right clothing, get it today. We have extended the open campus until lunch. You have..."
He paused and glanced at his watch.
4 hours. Breakfast is available at the cafeteria until 8:30. You have class at 1 in the ground floor of the Cheney Building, room 103.
He turned and stalked off a few feet, obviously waiting for the ambulance. I ignored him.
"I'm going to get food. That was a nice warm-up, but nothing you could easily call a workout. See you later, losers."
I didn't have to look up to know it was Dwayne. I didn't care. The others dispersed, and I let them. I watched the girl caught up as a pawn in a game she didn't even know existed, and wondered what to do. Chapter 6. Section 1.1.1. Any mage that refuses or evades the Mage Registration and Service Act is declared an active danger to the integrity of the United States. A special task force shall be established to hunt down all rogue mages and ensure they are not a danger to the populace at large. At no time shall avoidance of the draft be regarded as acceptable. The ambulance had picked up Bridget, and the 2 EMTs were kind to her, so at least for the next few hours I had faith that she would be okay. By then, it was 8, and I knew I needed food to survive the day. Carelian and I ran to the cafeteria and flew through the sparse breakfast offerings. Yet another thing that made no sense. I might need Carelian to go get me some energy bars just so I had something to eat. The cafeteria did have coffee. Not the best, but it was drinkable, and they had real cream. That made my day better. I sat in the back, having grabbed 1 plate for Carelian and 1 for me. He'd demanded bacon, and I gave him an evil eye. Despite what he thought, bacon for every meal wasn't healthy. The serving person had protested that they had familiar food available. We looked at it, and it was the cheapest brand possible. I just looked at her and said, "You convince him to eat that." Then walked away. He got his bacon. The food at least was edible, nothing compared to how Joe or Sable cooked, but edible. I ate the eggs and bacon, thinking about Bridget. I had no idea what to do about her. I also didn't know what happened to mages in the past that had disabilities of her level. Okay, that was a lie. I was very sure they had been killed. The mage reportedly hurt in an unfortunate training accident. I wanted to be sick. The idea had disturbed me when I learned of it. But what could I do? It was a theory, a statistic, and I learned it and moved on. But now, it was a person. A young woman with hair that was almost pink in the sunlight, and a smile that had no guile or plans behind it.
"The young woman is simple?"
His voice had a lilt to it, as if he wasn't sure what word to use. Simple or disabled, she had a genetic abnormality that causes confusion with the instructions her cells follow. There are many side effects. I could recite all the details about the chromosome and how it affected its victims, but it didn't matter. Bridget was here, and I didn't know what to do about it.
"Ah, and you allow them to live?"
His voice was careful. The clashes over culture had been many over the years, especially regarding prisons. Almost all the beings from other realms I'd met had a horror of them. I flinched at that, but I had expected it. A few years ago, while Carelian was off on a hunt somewhere, Esmir and I had a conversation about damaged children. She saw one with either cerebral palsy or something else in a wheelchair in a movie we were watching. I'd explained about disabilities and damage. She'd been deeply disturbed at the idea that we allowed damaged children to live. I'd laughed. What do you expect us to do? Kill them? Yes, she'd hissed in my mind. Just like I killed mine that were not right. You don't allow the damaged ones to live, to reproduce. She stepped into a rip and didn't speak to me for a month. We'd mutually agreed to not discuss the topic, but I understood where she was coming from. On Earth, animals often killed those that were damaged or deformed or injured. And the realms had nothing like hospitals, though Esmir was a healer. The idea struck me for the first time, if that was why she'd become a healer, because she'd had to kill her own children, that she was looking for a way to fix them. I pushed it to the side as I tried to figure out the issue of Bridget and the department looking for ways to kill their problem children. I had identified why 4 of the mages were here, with me. So far, it seemed like we were all risks or dangerous. None of us fit into the nice little mold the draft board thought we should. I finished eating and headed back to the dorm. He'd said we'd had until after lunch to be back on campus, though calling anyone without a phone was a pain. Walking back in the dorm building, I noticed a landline. Okay, I haven't seen one of those in a while. I looked at the phone and realized I had no idea what number to call for food or supplies. Taking the phones had been a brilliant move and annoying. Screw it. I didn't have time or energy to deal with doing it the long, hard way. Part of me wondered how the others were managing it. I jogged up the stairs to my room, Carelian behind me. I changed to mind speech just in case they were bugging these rooms. Can you open a rip, please? I need to talk to... I paused and glanced at my watch, trying to figure out where they'd be right now. Sable should be at work in her office. She usually wasn't in the field until the afternoon, but Joe would have been in the field for an hour. Sable. Carelian was agitated and pacing back and forth.
You will have to kill the sweet girl.
I blanched and swallowed, my breakfast suddenly considering making a reappearance. I don't want to kill her at all. I wouldn't kill her. That is not my plan. I want to avoid her getting killed at all costs. My voice overly loud, and I sighed, sinking down on the bed.
Will you be able to?
His words sank like lead rocks into my chest. The rip, please. I had zero desire to talk about the death of someone, but his words conjured images of her throwing an angry fit, fire lashing out everywhere, with no control, just emotions. Elementalists were more likely to have that happen, and Bridget had no idea how to control the power she had. I saw his glare and ignored it. How in the world did I argue something that I didn't know how I felt about? The spike of pain appeared, and I sent a knock to Sable. Sable? Have a few? I sent the message, flopping back on the tiny bed. Carelian was right. My king bed was much nicer. For you? Always. What's up? Definitely the isolation was an excellent ploy, but it just served to make me wonder who they had isolated Bridget from. A few things. 1, can you get me a coffee maker and coffee? Running before I even get a cup is completely unfair. Wow, they do like taking your life in their hands. But sure, I can grab a simple drip coffee maker. Sable knew my opinion of pod coffee makers. And some decent coffee. Thanks. The food won't make me rave about it, but I won't die, so I'm fine there. I paused, trying to figure out what else I needed and how to broach the subject. Corey, what's wrong? Her gentle thoughts poked at me, and I sighed. What do you know about mages that are disabled or damaged in some way? I mean, what happens to them? There was a long pause, and I could imagine the crease of her brows as she looked at me. What do you mean? What happens to them? If a mage with massive disabilities, and I'm not talking Joe's dyslexia, but like cerebral palsy or something else, emerges, what happens? I think I was hoping she knew of some magical place where they were made happy and taken care of. Maybe I just wanted to believe that. I don't know. Other than the case studies where I think most of them had to be killed to stop them from hurting others, I'm not sure I've ever known one. Why? With a mental sigh that felt like it came from the dark recesses of my soul, I explained about Bridget. Oh, Corey, only you. I don't know. I can ask, but I think we both know what the responses will be. Oh yeah, discomfort and avoidance. I knew that reaction all too well. Anything else I can do besides the coffee? I looked at the computer and my clothes. Yeah, I'll need a printer. He's going to expect papers nightly. If I had a printer, I could be nice and let others use it. Ouch, your orientation is much different from mine. I've got an extra one at home you can use. I'll send it over, if I can figure out how to send it with Carelian. Thanks, Sable. I miss you guys, and I've only been here a day. I laughed in amusement at myself. We miss you too. Feels weird not having you there. You'll figure it out. Sable's reassurance didn't really help. Thanks. Remember, daily check-ins. I have no idea what else they are going to try to pull. Got it. No burning down the campus. Hey, I'm not the firebug. Have it swallowed by the earth? No, that's a totally different option. I stuck my tongue out at her in my imagination. She just laughed and closed the connection. I looked at Carelian, speaking out loud. I do seem to end up in regular disasters, don't I?
Part of why I'm your focus. The last few years have been boring.
I snorted. Working my butt off wasn't boring.
No one died. No trips to realms. Boring.
Glad to know I exist to amuse you. He lifted his head from the floor, ears flicking my way.
What else did you think you were for?
I groaned and levered myself off the floor. Nothing would be ready for me until this evening, and I smelled like I felt, hot and sweaty. With a grunt of effort, more emotional than physical, I heaved myself off the bed and grabbed my shower stuff. Time to brave shared showers. They weren't bad, but it wasn't until I stepped out that it dawned on me. I had no towel. I stood there, dripping wet for a long time. I glared at my workout clothes. Using them to dry off would defeat the purpose of showering. With a sigh of exasperation, I picked up my sweaty clothes and my shower stuff and walked back to the room, dripping water as I went. Miss Perfect feels she needs to show off the perfect body, too. What, you're that desperate? I paused 10 steps from the door to my room and rotated to face the speaker. I didn't bother to try covering up. One of the advantages of years of working in fire stations was I'd been yanked out of the shower more than once, and seen more than enough bodies in various stages of undress to not really care about nudity. Besides, the hallway was muggy and being naked almost felt comfortable. It was the female mage who'd worn too tight clothes last night and still wore the skimpiest shorts for running I'd ever seen. She'd managed to find sneakers, which relieved me because running in stilettos would have been a recipe for disaster. Or entertaining. She had her hair in a natural afro, creating a puff of curls around her head like a halo, skin as dark as Sable's, and a figure like Joe's without the muscle. The sneer on her face detracted from her beauty. It's been a while since I've had to remember to take a towel with me, I said mildly, too used to hotels or my own bathroom. You sure you weren't just trying to use your body to distract others? She canted her hips towards me with an aggressive glare at me. I glanced down at my decidedly normal body, white skin. I never sunbathed nude, so I looked like a sheet of computer paper. Tan lines, B-size breasts, and hips that needed to lose a little weight. I spread out my arms, hair still a sodden lump down my back, and smiled. Is it working? Are you distracted? Huh? No. I'm not into girls. She sputtered, crossing her arms defensively. So, Walking naked on the girls' floor with what I assume are mostly hetero girls is supposed to distract you how? I just stared at her, making sure I had a slightly puzzled expression. I mean, well, guys could come up here, she said. Have at them. Not that interested. But I'm starting to get cold and I need to deal with my hair before class. I turned, heading for my door. You're weird, she said slowly. Nope, name's Corey. Nice to meet you. I shot a thought at Carelian. Open the door, please, and will you get towels when you see Sable? The door swung open and he snickered at me. I can lick you dry. I shut it behind me and gave him a look. No, you'd take all my skin with it.
Yum, fresh mage.
He snarked back. I threw my clothes at him. Chapter 7 Section 2.20.6 Infractions are treated the same as the general populace. However, community service should be aimed at using the mage's skill in a way to benefit the local jurisdiction. They scheduled our law class to begin at 1, and I wanted to eat again before that. The idea of law class again after taking it in college made little sense. Sable had sworn hers was much more interesting than what the college course had been, and was much more practical. I grabbed a notebook and headed out, but paused by the door with the name Bridget O'Keefe on the door. Anyone coming? I asked Carelian, trusting his ears much more than mine.
Ooh, mischief. There is no one coming up the stairs, though there are people in other rooms.
He turned and peered down the hall. I turned the knob, expecting a locked door. It would give me a chance to practice my transform abilities. I knew I should be able to make a key from any object by keeping it malleable and sliding it into a lock, and adapting to the lock as I went, in theory. It wasn't something I had played with that much, but the knob turned in my hand and the door swung open. My conscience battered at me, but I needed to know who she was. If I could figure that out, I might be able to contact someone. I stepped in and looked around. I needed more than a name. I shut the door behind the two of us and looked. The room looked identical to mine, even down to the same linoleum pattern. A duffel bag sat in the closet, and the bed was ruffled, like someone had slept in it. There, on the desk, was a small purse, and I rifled through it, finding, to my joy, ID. I copied down the name and address in my notebook. It was something, if nothing else, maybe someone to call, if I could find the number. Dejected at not finding any other contact information, phones were important, I put it back and went to the door. Anyone?
No,
he said, a whisper even in my mind. I opened the door and we slipped out. We headed down the stairs to the cafeteria again, and I made a mental promise to memorize all the important numbers in my life. Having a phone made you dependent on it. I needed to make sure I knew how to contact people without it. I couldn't mind speak to everyone. Noise echoed up from the lobby as I came down and glanced in. Standing in there talking was the spandex girl, Neil, and a Chinese man. I debated about stopping to say hi, and finally turned into that side of the lobby. Either way, I needed to eat, and I really hoped they had better food for lunch. Hey! I flashed them my paramedic smile, the one that said I'm here to help and I'm not scary. They froze and looked at me, as if I'd caught them doing something. That just made me more curious. I'm Corey. I met Neil last night, but I don't think we were introduced. The woman smiled at me, her earlier bravado back. Oh, I'd say we've been very intimate, but my name's Yvette Jones. You look cuter with clothes on. I just smiled. It's nice to meet you, but I thought you weren't into women. Years of Joe and Sable flirting with each other and teasing me meant sexual things couldn't faze me, though I still didn't understand the interest in sex. Joe and Sable sure seemed to enjoy it. She flushed a bit and shrugged, glaring at the others. Fen Long, he said, his voice flat. Neither of them offered to shake or anything. They just stood there, looking at me. I blinked for a moment, then channeled my dragon. I don't know about you, but I suspect class will be long. I'm headed to get some lunch first. Carelian brushed against my leg. Oh, yes, this is my familiar, Carelian. I petted his head while I talked. It was even with my waist. Doesn't that thing have to be on a leash? Yvette said, her eyes wide as she stepped back a bit. I don't like cats. He can be, but he is his own person, most of the time, and protected under the law. I smiled at them, all teeth and no eyes. Being polite is the wisest course of action. The three of them nodded, but Feng's eyes were narrowed and focused on me. Well, see you at class if I don't see you at lunch. I waved, feeling like a prize idiot, then spun on my heel. This place is nuts. You still suspecting an ambush? I said the thoughts to Carelian. My entire back crawled with the feeling someone was watching me. The lessons I'd learned when I had assassins after me didn't let me dismiss the feeling. I brought up a shield of electromagnetic energy and coated my body with it. Dirt or air could be much better, but dirt was too obvious, and air I was null in. I could listen occasionally, but for a long-term spell, it got expensive. I rarely used this one as it tended to fry my phone or drain it. That we had learned the hard way. I could use metal, but then I needed a source of the metal, and it made me look like the Tin Man walking around. I tried to see if anyone followed me out, but if they did, I never noticed. We walked to the cafeteria with Carelian acting like an excited dog, darting various directions to sniff or investigate objects. Find anything? I asked as I filled up plates for both of us.
No, but this entire place reeks of deception and schemes. How did I end up in a place that reminds me of the Court of Lords?
I shot him a glance at that. No idea what it meant. But here wasn't the place to get into other realm politics. I didn't want to get involved in Earth politics if I had a choice. In the cafeteria, I sat at a table, watching the bored kitchen staff. How much money was it costing to have all these people here for 10 mages plus? What, 2, maybe 3 teachers or draft officers? Others trickled in as I picked at my food. The meals still sucked, but at least the hamburger was edible. The fries weren't, much to my disappointment. Neil, Claudia, Ben, and Dwayne came in, and I saw 2 others whose names I hadn't figured out. One girl dressed in ragged clothes with her hair lumpy and uneven came in, not looking at anyone. She got Jell-O and an apple, nothing more. The other was a young man who looked like he needed an extra 1,000 calories a day, and someone to tell him plaid pants for men hadn't been fashionable this century. The girl just slunk to a table and picked at the Jell-O. That surprised me given the amount of what I assumed were offerings missing from her hair. Mages needed food to stay healthy. The body prioritized what was missing. Unlike blood or skin, hair wasn't treated as something the body needed to replace, but even to grow hair required calories. May I join you? The voice pulled me away from my musings over the girl. I looked up at plaid pants, striped polo, and a nervous smile on a face with entropy on his temple. Sure. I kept my voice light and friendly. I'm Corey. I offered, and he grinned a nervous grin. What annoyed me was I don't think his eyes got above the neckline on my shirt. A modest scoop neck that barely hinted at cleavage. I'd decided a long time ago to dress for competence, not sexuality. That was all Joe and Indira. They loved having people look at their bodies. It made me uncomfortable. Jake, he muttered as he collapsed into the seat across from me. I heard a soft growl from Carelian, but I waved my hand at him under the table. I might as well see where this went. Entropy, huh? So, did you get your degree? In what? I started with pleasant conversation. At some point, making friends instead of scoping people out would occur. Yeah, wizard, he said, identifying the middle rank of mages. You have great boobs. What? I had to process that to even figure out what he said. Boobs, yours are great.
I'd like to see them sometime.
If he so much as lays a hand on you, I will use his bones as toothpicks.
Carelian snarled in my head, but I knew it was to me only. My mouth opened and closed, and I didn't even know how to respond. I looked around, almost expecting someone to yell out, "Gotcha!" But no one paid much attention to us. "That isn't appropriate," I managed to say. I was so shocked I didn't even know how to react. He just shrugged.
"I like boobs. You have good boobs. Better if I could see them. Oh, can I touch them?"
That burned off my shock, and I leaned forward a tiny bit. The spark of excitement in his eyes made me nauseous. "If you so much as touch me, it is assault, and I will disable the tendons in your arms and legs so you can't run, can't do anything but thrash, and I will sit back and watch my familiar eat you. One bite at a time. You can scream and beg and plead, and I will just watch." His eyes jerked up to look at me in the face, and I smiled, showing all my teeth. "Don't offend people. It will get you killed, and the second you touch someone, it vaporizes all their restraints." I learned that lesson very quickly. He just blinked, looking at me. I stood up, taking my tray, and walked over to dispose of it, then walked out. I pulled the magnetic shield back up as I stepped out the door.
Who does that thing think he is? He is not good enough for my queens, any of my queens. He should beg to be allowed the honor to groom your foot.
Carelian was almost sputtering, he was so mad. His fur fluffed out, creating a ridge of spikes down his spine. I didn't respond. My brain was having issues with the blatant sexism and almost harassment, but then most people weren't that stupid. And that was the part I was sticking on. Why would anyone say that? Carelian was still sputtering in my mind as I reached the classroom. It was obvious which one it was, and I sat down at the back, so no one could sit behind me. Taking out my notebook, I waited to see the students. I wanted a chance to analyze and evaluate each person when I wasn't trying to do something else. The first in was Claudia, arms wrapped around her waist so that even in the muggy heat of a North Carolina summer, she looked cold. Ben and Dwayne walked in together, joking and smiling, but they moved as if every muscle was ready to react. Maybe people were realizing how serious this was. The straggly girl who needed a few thousand calories sunk in, followed by Jake, his eyes latched on her ass. I sighed. If he were a reject collection, I could understand some of the issues. But while I could see why Claudia and Neil were here, and even Jake if he was that socially clueless, that left unknown girl, Feng, Yvette, Ben, and Dan. Were they here just because, or to leverage me into something worthy of punishment? That idea chilled me to the bone, even as I acknowledged the possibility. The others strolled in, Yvette and Feng pretending the others didn't exist. Lovers spat already? I groaned and rubbed my temples. This couldn't be this huge of a conspiracy just to eliminate me. It felt like something I needed to talk to Esmir about, but before I could finish processing that line of thought, Camp walked in. He slammed the door behind him, and most of the students jumped or started turning to look at him. I saw a few pale, and Claudia and the other girl I didn't know shrank back a bit. Jake was still sitting behind and between Claudia and Yvette, but I couldn't see what he focused on. Somehow I didn't think it was Camp.
"I see most of you made it this far. Better than I expected, though I understand one of your number has already ended up in the hospital. That is a valid reason to miss class, though I wouldn't recommend it as a way out."
He smirked, and my stomach clenched. Where was Bridget?
"Now that we are here, we will dive into the laws that enable you to serve. Never think of your draft as a punishment. It is a reward for being allowed to live in this great country. Other countries ask more of their mages than we do, so it is up to you to prove you are the best and give your all to the job of serving your country."
His passion and intensity had at least Ben, Dwayne, and Feng sitting up and looking proud. He's a true believer. I didn't know if that was a good or bad thing. It just told me he believed in what he was doing and wouldn't regret having to put a bullet in any of us for the good of the country. That made me nervous.
Before we get going over the laws that rule your life from now on, we will talk about the ones you broke to get here. And you want to memorize these laws because breaking them from now on could have serious penalties.
He slapped open a notebook on the podium and started with the first person on that row, the choppy, worn-down girl. It tore at my conscience. I wanted to know what was up with these people, but at the same time, the idea of hearing their crimes kind of creeped me out. I cycled through the laws, trying to come up with a concrete objection. But this wasn't medical, and I didn't think he was a doctor, so HIPAA didn't apply. Before anything occurred to me, he started to speak.
Yes, I think you all deserve to know exactly what sort of reprobates and, in some cases, monsters you have here with you. And let's start with Elizabeth Duncan.
The girl in question hunched down even further, and I prepared to stop him if he hit her. This whole thing felt like a train wreck, and I'm in the middle, per usual. Chapter 8, Section 2.20.19. Mages have the right to use their abilities to protect themselves, defend others, and assist in times of need. Their magic shall be treated the same as a weapon, with the same level of due diligence applied. Any reasonable expectation of harm can be regarded as need to protect themselves. But he didn't attack her. His body language shouted that he wanted to drag her to her feet and hit her until she hit back. But he just sneered and started to talk.
Elizabeth Duncan, drug addict, 5 counts of using before you emerged and 2 since. 1 more arrest for using will bump you up to a felony level, but if we catch you dealing, that will make it a level B or A felony. And I'm sure all of you know what that means.
I knew I did, but apparently some of them gave him blank looks. Camp snorted and walked to the whiteboard behind him.
Felonies are broken down into classes, E through A. Class B and A felonies carry serious time for the rest of us, but for mages they carry a death sentence. For Class E through C, you just get extra time. Isn't that right, Benjamin Traynor?
He wrote the letters A, B, C, D, E on the board. The man in question stiffened and looked down at his desk. I felt magic build and waited for an explosion, but Ben just curled into himself.
Traynor doesn't feel like talking about what he did. What a shame. It was rather ingenious, and doubled his draft to make sure his country had recompense for his actions.
Camp had this attitude that was worse than nails on a chalkboard. A flush of red swept up Ben's face, but he just curled in tighter, though I could see his hands were clenched into fists. I moved my attention back to Brian Camp, who was smirking.
Now that we know what the penalties are, let's go over why you are here and what you can do to ensure you make it out of the draft.
He snorted, contempt etched into every inch.
Neil Lang. Inability to do the coursework required. Refusal of secondary education and all assessment tests.
Camp actually frowned as he spoke, eyes locked on Neil. But did that qualify as a redeeming emotion from him or not?
The refusal requires you to enter the draft now, but makes you a liability as you don't know how to use your magic. Your coursework in first year will be different than the rest, as you will need to be educated on how to use magic. But for this month, you'll go through the basics with us. Your fate is one of the few I am not positive about. Who knows, maybe you'll surprise me. It has happened before.
He smiled, and half the class pulled back. Neil just looked constipated and resentful. I couldn't blame him. Camp's smile, which I think was supposed to be reassuring, Looked more like a shark about to eat you.
Claudia Morgan. Attempted arson. 3 counts, but at least 2 of them were dismissed as you didn't even get the rags to burn. You claimed you were forced into it. Lucky the judge felt sorry for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be my problem now. Also a bit ridiculous that a fire mage can't set things on fire.
He focused on me while he talked. I just smiled back and split my attention between him and Claudia. The woman looked ready to burst into tears. She needed to get over it and quit being stupid. But then my temper and patience were fraying. I took a deep breath, trying to recenter myself and quit letting this jerk get to me. I felt like he was almost disappointed I didn't react. Instead, he turned to Yvette, smiling.
Yvette Thompson. Bachelor's in biology and arrested twice for solicitation. 3 other possible charges prior to emerging.
I was sitting so I could see her profile and watched carefully. She didn't cower, just shrugged and smiled a sexy smile. Ain't solicitation if I'm not paid. It's just a good time. And gifts don't count. Isn't a girl worth pretty gifts?
If you can learn to channel that attitude in the correct way, I'm sure you'll be an excellent mage for the draft. Otherwise, you might be here a very long time.
Her back stiffened, and I swear I saw a bit of vaporization from the midst of her afro. But nothing happened, and he moved on. While embarrassing people like this wasn't anything I enjoyed, it did give me a lot of information, and I was writing it down. I had an idea of who to contact to get more information. Besides, I hadn't talked to Charles in almost 2 weeks.
Ah, yes, our perv. Peeping Tom charges, upskirt picture taking, installing recording devices in changing rooms, and drilling holes into the girls' locker room. All the charges were misdemeanors so far, but you've been following a set pattern, which leads to assault and rape.
Brian moved so he stood directly in front of Jake, and I could only see the back of Jake's low ponytail.
I fully expect you to be stupid and try something with a female mage, and she's going to rip your heart out. I will enjoy seeing you go down.
Hurting me breaks the rules,
he muttered, and even from here it sounded like he was pouting. Brian stepped back and wrote a number on the board.
Section 2.20.19. Okay, mages. He sneered that part. Deserting him break the rules.
Everyone just looked down, unwilling to meet his eyes. No, not if he touches me first. My voice rang clear in the tense classroom. Brian Camp turned to me, his smile a bit more forced.
Please educate Miss Monroe for the others in here.
I gave him my biggest smile and let a bit more Southern seep into my accent. I was a Georgia girl after all. You used the weapons you had. If someone touches you, it is assault. You are allowed to protect yourself however you want, including using magic pursuant to Section 2.20.20. I flicked my eyes over to Jake, letting them narrow a little. Or allowing their familiars to protect them, Section 2.20.21. Camp's eyes tightened, and the smile didn't touch them as he stared at me. With an aborted snarl, he moved his gaze back to Jake.
Exactly. So if you decide to cross the line, I expect I will be cleaning you up in a body bag.
Jake's shoulders hunched with his arms crossing his chest. I wanted to roll my eyes, but as long as he didn't make my familiar get in trouble, I didn't care. Camp lifted his head and smiled.
Now, next in our little group, Dwayne Jordan. All-star in high school. Father is a famous sports personality. Yes, he is.
Dwayne didn't flinch. He just sneered back at Camp.
And he'll get me out of this mess. I'm not supposed to be here. I haven't broken any of the laws applicable to mages.
Camp crossed his arms and tapped his fingers in a fast pattern.
That is true. You weren't convicted of anything prior to emerging, and no one has pressed any more charges against you. So far. However, your father managed to get 3 date rape charges against you swept under the rug, and all the girls had their college paid for.
Dwayne shrugged.
They were interested. They just changed their minds. Not my problem. Before or after you drugged them?
Camp asked, almost sounding interested. While Camp was fixated on Dwayne, all I could see was his posture. Dwayne was slouched in the chair and relaxed, bouncing his head as if listening to music.
Either way, I suspect you will remain true to form. If you rape a mage during your draft, rest assured, not even your father will be able to get the charges lifted, assuming you live. Most rapists don't.
Camp snarled out that last part, sounding angrier than he had with anyone else.
Whatevs. You can't do anything to me.
Dwayne dismissed him and looked over at Ben, smirking. I expected Camp to do something, but he stepped back and looked at Feng Long. That man had sat down and remained perfectly still. Until Camp focused on him, I'd forgotten he was there. He hadn't moved at all.
Feng Long.
He said the name with such distaste it surprised me. What had this man done?
Former hacker. Took down and held hostage multiple municipalities before you were 15. Sentenced to 10 years with no electronics at all. Then you emerged. They had to figure out how to get you educated without letting you into computers. But it turns out you lost your touch in a decade without being able to use them. So they think your teeth are pulled.
Camp leaned close, and I was very glad that I wasn't sitting in the front 2 rows.
I, on the other hand, believe once a criminal, always a criminal.
Camp straightened, and Long hadn't moved, still sitting like a statue. That guy is human, right? I asked Carelian, wondering if he was something else.
Yes,
Carelian said, his tone matching his lashing tail.
Though I think both he and Feng are awful, not worth saving. They should both be buried.
I fought not to laugh at that image and sat back. So far, he'd gone through everyone. That left me and Bridget. He smiled up at me, and I just looked back at him.
And that leaves Corey Monroe,
he said, his voice sugary sweet. Oh, well, I am fascinated to learn what I've done. What about Bridget O'Keefe? Or doesn't she rate? I said, not reveling in the attention, but controlling it as everyone turned to look at me. Something flashed across his face.
Yes, we must not forget Bridget. She won't be back until tomorrow, but her kind never last. They can't.
What sort of shit is that? I burst out, my cool vanishing. The superior look vanished, and he growled.
The only option we have. If she cannot meet the terms of the draft, she will suffer the consequences. And if she misuses her magic, she will pay the price.
I wanted to protest. There had to be something, but even I couldn't come up with an answer right then. She wouldn't be back until tomorrow, so I had time. I could figure out something. And what? Change the world? I don't have that kind of power. I wanted to stew on it, but Camp shook off whatever momentary emotion had affected him.
Shall we talk about you, Corey?
I grabbed my frustration and worry about Bridget and shoved it to the back of my mind. I hated when theoretical ethical issues were shoved in my face, but right now there wasn't anything I could do, and I had no ideas. Yes, please, I said, faking disinterest. Did I kill someone, or am I in trouble for jaywalking? My snark might have been getting the better of me, but right now we had a rapist, drug addict, perv, prostitute, and a hacker. Who knew what Benjamin had actually done? But I was starting to see they figured, why not take care of all their issues at the same time? He smiled, but it didn't warm me or anyone else.
No, you just think you're above the law and have to call in reinforcements to blackmail everyone into treating you like you are special. Yes, I know all about you.
The sneer in his voice should have sliced me. At this point, everyone was looking at me with varying levels of curiosity and concern. Well, everyone except Elizabeth and Feng. For her part, Elizabeth just kept picking at her arm, and even from here I could see the spot of blood. Feng remained stiff as a board, looking straight ahead. No, I wasn't above the law. It didn't apply to me at that time via your own laws. As for reinforcements, I let my voice dangle with sarcasm. Trust me, I didn't ask them to come. They chose me, and if you had been there, you would understand that they are not beings I control.
Oh, I heard all about it, he said, shrugging. Smoke and mirrors and adrenaline changing their perspective as to what was really there.
I looked at him and started laughing. There was a snort from Carelian, and I figured he was laughing too. My laughter did get everyone's attention, even Feng. I couldn't stop the giggles at what they had to do to convince themselves that Salistra and Tursane and even Bob weren't what they were.
Are you laughing at me?
He demanded, his face paling. I just shook my head, trying to get my giggles under control. It took me a second, and the color started flushing back into his face before I could get my answer ready. No, I was just laughing at the idea of people thinking it was fake. It wasn't, and I really hope no one ever realizes how real it was. He looked like he wanted to wrap his hands around my throat and squeeze. Instead, he glared at me, hands shoved in his pockets.
By the time you are done here, I will make sure you understand your place in our world.
The phrasing surprised me. I covered my mouth, trying to stop the giggles. I'm sure you will. He stood there for a minute, trying to decide how to respond. With a huff of annoyance, he spun and went back to the board.
First section,
he wrote on the board with hard jabs.
We will cover exactly what Miss Monroe did, why it is illegal, and you will be required to write up a one-page paper explaining why what she did should have been breaking the law.
Except it wasn't, I said sweetly. So the only way to write a paper providing that I should have been punished is to either change the law or the situation. He glared. I smiled back at him. The arguments between Stephen Alexant and Harold Lefone had proven that, and I knew that. With a snarl, Brian Camp turned away.
Your assignment is to write a paper on all the things the agent in charge did wrong. That if the paperwork had been followed, Corey Monroe would have been punished for breaking the law.
He said this to the class as a whole, and I responded, Oh, I can definitely do that, but there is no way for anyone else to have any idea what the particulars were. So, what would you like them to do? I leaned forward and tried to ignore Carelian snickering in my head. I could be a real pain when I wanted. Camp growled a bit, and I knew I had him. The case had been filed, finding in my favor, and he had to be aware of it.
Everyone else will write out the first 3 sections of the mage laws and provide an example situation where they would apply.
Do you have a copy of those? Claudia said meekly.
You implying you don't know them?
He sniped at her, and I sighed. The poor girl was about to get his irritation with me played out on her. Not fair. She looked around the classroom, and I could see the panicked looks on most of their faces. Feng didn't react at all. He was just weird.
Well, look it up on your computers. You have limited internet just for that purpose.
Camp snapped as he put the pen back down on the tray under the board. He must have been overly frustrated because when the pen landed, the tray snapped off, falling to the floor with a crash.
Okay, who did that?
He raged, whirling to look at all of us. I checked for Murphy on me. Nothing. Then I looked at him. Murphy. Well, multiple Murphys were wrapped around him, almost cloaking him from view in mage sight. Ugh, great. With a muffled sigh, I dispersed them, making sure I offered up leg hair. I didn't need anyone to realize I'd used magic.
Let me remind you, using magic against me is a violation of Section 1.3.4. In fact, let's go over that section.
He started to drone about the laws, and I settled back to watch the class. There were only 2 mages in the class with relativity beside me, and there had been at least 3 or 4 spells on him. This would be more interesting than I thought. Chapter 9. Section 2.20.1. If convicted for a Class C, B, or A felony, the penalty is immediate death, given the impossibility of controlling a mage. The introductory section on laws governing mages and the draft was long and boring, at least to me. The others seemed clueless as to the laws that they were required to follow. Carelian started to snore an hour into it, though no one else seemed to notice. I made notes on a few aspects Brian Camp pointed out that I hadn't thought of, but often he twisted the specific law to make it appear as punitive as possible. There were a few cases where I completely disagreed with his interpretation, but most of them were things it would take a court case to solve. I had zero desire to be involved in a court case. We left with the assignment of a 1-page paper about the first 3 sections of the mage laws, while I had an after-action report about that day. Good thing Stephen and I had debated it nonstop, and I knew all the details. No one walked near me as I headed back to the dorm, which didn't hurt my feelings at all. I didn't want much to do with any of them, though maybe Yvette and Elizabeth had my sympathy. Maybe. It felt like I had crossed a minefield by the time I got back to my dorm with Carelian by my side.
I'm going to visit my Malkin, then stop to see my other queens. I will be back tonight with your requested things.
He said that, slightly disparagingly. Thank you, Carelian. I do appreciate you doing this for me. I spoke idly, figuring letting any listeners wonder would only help me. But I think you just want to avoid the food they are likely to serve. I heard the humor as he replied.
Wouldn't you prefer to eat Joe's cooking, or even Sable's to what you are likely to be served?
With that parting remark, he opened a hole in reality and vanished. I sighed. He wasn't wrong about that. No phone meant no music, or at least subpar. There was Wi-Fi and I connected, then set up a VPN to make sure what I did online wasn't tracked, because I needed some help. I pulled up a chat program and my word processing program. I needed to get the paper out of my way and try to prep as best as I could. I stared at the chat program for a long moment before I clicked on the icon for Charles Wainscott. Over the last few years, he'd grown a lot, and the acne had faded, turning him into a handsome young man, if a bit stern and overly orderly. Joe had asked once, and it was a true ask, if Charles and I would get together. It had been after the stalker issue. Because it was Joe, I had given that question a lot of thought, but shook my head and replied that it was unlikely. I liked him, I enjoyed talking to him, and the occasional hug was nice, but neither of us felt anything more than that. He told me once he was a very firm demisexual, and most people couldn't get past Ericina and his own cold logic to make it to the next stage. Personally, I thought if Joe or Sable had been bisexual, they probably would have ended up dating him. I just enjoyed talking to him and Ericina, who had finally given in and agreed to talk directly to me. In her own words,
I built my own patterns.
His avatar was a picture of Ericina traced in neon colors. She glowed with beauty. It was how she dressed up on the first Halloween Carelian and I celebrated. The first year he was with me, we were too busy with the FBI, the OMO, and dealing with everything to even be aware of it. Cha-Cha was his handle online and what Ericina called him. Hey, have time and interest to do a bit of digging for me? Only legal stuff. I knew I needed to preface it with that. He was dangerous on a computer. The years of serving in the draft and working with computers had slowly moved him up into hacker territory. It didn't hurt that even complex algorithms just made sense to him. Are you in trouble again? His reply was immediate, and I glared at shining letters. I didn't do anything, I typed out, feeling almost hurt. Why did people think I was the one that caused these issues? I double-checked there wasn't a Murphy's cloak around me, just in case.
That doesn't change the question. What happened?
His responses were lightning fast, and I sighed. Draft orientation was a setup. They're trying to legally eliminate me. I'm just trying to figure out what else is going on. You up for helping? This time, there was a long pause before letters appeared.
You using the VPN I gave you?
Yes, and no cameras. I checked.
1 minute.
I spent the time waiting to work on my paper. It came out pretty easily, and a lot of the mistakes that Alexan had made, mostly from trusting me to follow the unspoken rules, were obvious in hindsight. But if he hadn't made them, they would have had legal justification to kill me. So overall, I was rather glad he'd screwed up.
I'm ready to go.
The words blinked at me, and I had to pull my mind back to what I was going to ask him to do. Bridget O'Keefe. She has Down syndrome. Mage. Soul. Not sure of her power level. Here's her address from her ID. I provided all of that, took a deep breath, and typed. I need to know if she has family. I don't know where she was pulled from or if she has a support structure. They took our phones, and I suspect hers is the only way she had to communicate. In my mind, I could see the expression on his face. Cold, remote, and that clenching of teeth he got when anyone helpless was being abused. He was such a crusader about people not being bullied.
So what do you want to do with that information?
I stared at my computer, trying to figure out that answer. I don't know. Maybe know who to call? I'd like to know if they... I paused. What did I want to know? Would they be happy Bridget was gone? Worried? Apathetic? Did she even have a home? Or did she live in a group home? I just want to know. Maybe it will present me with an option. I could feel his steady gaze and shifted as if he was really there.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah. Benjamin Traynor. Can you tell me what he was convicted of before merging? I know it was a Class E or D felony, but not what.
Is everyone you are with a felon?
Knowing Charles, he was serious about the question. Or close enough. Drug addict, rapist, peeping Tom. Do I need to go on?
Huh. Interesting orientation. Glad mine was much more boring.
That would have been nice. My life never worked that well.
I'll ping you later tonight. Bye.
As always, Charles was abrupt and to the point. I shook my head, missing Carelian and his comments. I ordered multiple copies of the Mage Laws to be delivered here overnight. I felt like I was spending money like crazy on nothing, but a few $100s this month would be fine. I still didn't feel rich, but I was well past the point of being broke. Scrimping for years had long-term advantages. An hour later, the paper was done, and I was ready for dinner, whatever that was going to be. But that meant dealing with the strangers at best, enemies at worst, and I didn't know if I had that level of patience today. My grumbling stomach told me I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my key and headed out into the hall. I made note of the other names on the doors and found it interesting that they had empty rooms between all of us. But then, with only 5 women, that was bound to happen. I walked to the common area and saw Jake coming out of the little kitchen area. He gave me a smarmy smile. I nodded and kept on walking. Of all of them, he was the weirdest. I heard him following me, but he never got close enough to talk. And I kept up a heightened awareness the entire time, as well as a shield. Good thing I had closed-toed shoes. It made offering up my toenails almost invisible. The same 2 servers were waiting for us with food that was just as unappetizing as lunch. So far, breakfast had been the best meal. But how badly could you screw up pancakes and eggs? I picked up the salad, wilted, and started to wonder if there was a way around the closed campus edict. This was going to be torture, for the food alone if nothing else. A tray clanged down onto my table, and I looked up to see Dwayne dropping down in the chair across from me. Yvette followed him a moment later. Yes, please, join me. I said, sarcasm dripping off every word.
Excellent. See, I knew you'd be glad to have me here.
His smile was so polished and perfect, I wondered how long he practiced in the mirror. Us, interjected Yvette with a smile. She settled in at the table, and I watched them. Double team or clearing the way? I wouldn't say that, but I'm not sure the company can be worse than the food. I held up a forkful of salad lettuce topped with canned chicken. They both looked down at their plates and sighed. I was pretty sure that reaction wasn't fake or false. I forced myself to eat, even if the temptation to sidestep home was getting larger and larger. A month of subpar meals would not kill me.
So, you're the famous Double Merlin, huh?
Dwayne asked after eating a few bites. He had grabbed meat with some type of mashed vegetable. I'm a Double Merlin. Don't know what you mean by famous. I poked at the salad and decided if Carelian came back raving about what Joe and Sable fed him, I might have to refuse to brush him for a week.
Oh, they talk about you,
Dwayne said with a leering wink. And they would be?
The news, the houses, the government.
I shot him a hard look. And you know this how?
People like talking to my dad. He has parties, I listen.
He kept eating, and Yvette shifted in her seat, paying less attention to the food than I was. And who is your father? Dwayne jerked back as if I'd hit him, his jaw tightening as he glared at me.
You don't know who my dad is?
His already dark skin flushed, and he shook his head, making his dreads shake and the beads on them rattle. Should I? Is he the president? To be honest, outside the president and a few people involved with the draft, I didn't know many famous people. I hadn't cared. Still didn't. Dwayne blinked at me and seemed to deflate a bit.
No? I guess you don't watch sports?
Nope. Never had time or interest.
He's Andrew Jordan?
I just looked at him. The name vaguely familiar, but I couldn't pull it to the front, and I shrugged. He looked at me, face blank, then huffed out a sigh.
You are totally out of touch. My dad is a 3-time NBA MVP and has his own company. He's an influencer when it comes to sports and is moving into politics. Like I said, he has lots of friends.
Oh, okay. It had never occurred to me that people outside of maybe the draft board or Stephen Alexson's bosses might talk about me. So what are you going to do with all that power? If it was me, I'd be living like a queen, having people wait on me. No one would push me around. Yvette pushed her food around her plate, but her eyes never left me. The use of the word queen made me smile. There isn't much I can do. Not and be exactly what camp is talking about. With power comes a lot of rules. If I was you, I would make them follow my rules. You're powerful enough they couldn't stop you. She insisted. I gave her a funny look, wondering where she was going with this. Really? How? Well, you could always just eliminate anyone in your way. She hinted with a sly smile. Ah, I see. So who would that be? Camp? The draft board? How about the OMO? What about the House or Senate? She'd started to frown halfway through my recitation. How many people am I supposed to kill? Thanks, but I think I'll play by the rules and do my time. Everyone else has. I stood up and grabbed my tray. See you at PT tomorrow. I turned and walked away, now even more nervous about the game they were playing. Chapter 10, Section 2.20. All mages will face expedited trials for felonies. If deemed necessary by the jurisdiction they are in, drugs may be used to keep them unable to access their abilities, if they are deemed a threat by said jurisdiction. Carelian had pulled everything from home over for me, including some salmon with broccoli from Joe. That got him extra brushes that night. I woke in the morning, had a 4-ounce espresso, and was ready to go before Beecham started pounding on the door. Caffeine solved so many problems. The others struggled out into the early morning air, and I was both relieved and worried to see Bridget shuffling out with us. She had nice tennis shoes on, but I still rushed over to her. "Are you okay? Can you run?" She blinked at me, then smiled. "Nice lady. Kitty? Kitty?" She looked around for Carelian. "He's still asleep. Are your feet healed?" Bridget nodded at me rapidly, still smiling. "Doctor fixed them. All good." Huh. They got a mage to heal it. I thought about it, and it probably hadn't been that expensive, but usually you didn't get doctors to waste offerings on something that would heal itself. Draft pressure? Anything was possible.
Get in line. We're doing stretches, then a nice 2-mile jog,
barked out Beecham. I watched everyone else. Most of them seemed to have come up with sneakers and were at least accepting this aspect of life. But Bridget? My heart threatened to break as I tried to figure out what I could do, even as my mind went in circles. Our drill instructor led us in basic calisthenics, then started off at a slow pace. Bridget copied us with the exercises, and for the most part did okay. I noted Beecham didn't yell at her, just locked his jaw every time he saw her mess up, but she could run at the pace he set. We went through the campus slow enough it wasn't too much effort to keep up, but fast enough that talking wasn't wise. We were dismissed for breakfast with the warning of class at 9. "You know how to get to breakfast?" I asked her, still worried. "I have a map," she said with a bright smile. "But shower, I know my routines." She said all of this as if reciting rote information. I wanted to scream. This wasn't where she belonged. "Okay. Eat breakfast with me?" "Okay." Her voice bright and a smile wide as she headed to her room. I fought back tears. I didn't know if they were from rage or sadness, and headed to my room. I started another rich espresso, grabbed a towel, and headed for a quick shower. 10 minutes later, I had more caffeine in my system and was dressed to deal with camp. I made sure my paper was in my notebook. "You staying here or coming with?" I asked the cat, who had finally deigned to wake up.
Eggs are good. Rather have bacon.
"Don't look at me. I just want decent food." He stopped mid-groom to stare at me. "Okay, fine. Tolerable food." Carelian snorted and rose, following me out of the room. We went down to the entry, and I looked around for Bridget. She came out a minute later, her hair still damp. Her eyes lit up the moment she caught sight of Carelian. "Kitty!" She headed straight for Carelian, who purred and stood up straighter. They probably weighed about the same, so her falling to her knees to hug him didn't worry me. "Pretty kitty." She hugged him tight, then carefully petted him in long strokes from his head to the base of his tail.
"Sweet girl,"
he purred in my head, and I nodded. "Ready for breakfast, Bridget?" "Can the kitty come?" she asked, standing up, but her hand still lingering on Carelian. "Trust me, he likes bacon as much as I do." "I like bacon," she chirped, and began walking out with us. I saw the others glance at her and then pull away. I wanted to yell at them or beat them, but I understood and couldn't blame them. There had to be a way to save Bridget. But how? She stayed mostly quiet on the way to the cafeteria, occasionally pointing toward a bird or something. Her hair dried out into frizzes, and I had to resist the urge to braid it. At the meal line, she took eggs and pancakes and extra bacon that I knew Carelian would get. I let it be. He knew the risks of too much bacon. Everyone avoided us at breakfast. I figured 50% of the avoidance was due to Carelian, the other 50% to the girl. Yvette managed to smile and wave, but scurried over to another table rather than joining us. I watched Bridget, my heart breaking. She came across as a bright, sunny 10-year-old, and there was no way in the world she could follow the amount of education needed to use magic, at least in this realm. We walked to the class, and I saw everyone trailing us. Fine, they could think what they wanted. I had to follow my own moral code, but I wondered what the fallout would be. Camp walked in, talking before the door finished closing.
Put your papers in the basket and let's get going. Today we are going to talk about legal ways to use magic.
I pulled out my paper and dumped it in, along with most of the others. Bridget didn't, nor did Neil. I settled back in my seat, and Bridget kept most of her attention on Carelian. He reveled in her petting. Camp wrote on the board, Section 23.2, Magic as Income.
Now, let's use real-world examples. Let's say someone needs to get a bonfire started for a properly permitted party.
He turned and looked at us, his eyes burning into Claudia. I fought not to roll my eyes, but sympathy only went so far. How stupid could you be trying to burn places down for money? Arson was illegal for everyone, not just mages.
Could you accept money or barter in exchange for starting the fire?
He asked, looking at them. The rest of the students didn't look up. Well, except for Dwayne. He just slouched back in his chair looking bored.
Claudia, surely you know the answer to this,
Camp said, leaning over her. He had to outweigh her by at least 75 pounds. If the value of the work performed is less than $600 accumulative, it does not need to be reported. If it is over that amount, it must be reported as income. Her voice was a whisper.
And how much did they pay you to set fire to the house?
He didn't move from in front of her. 5,000, she said so low I had to strain to hear the words.
Ah, so that would have been reported on your taxes. But it wasn't, was it? So there you have a tax fraud. Then there is what you were asked to start the fire in.
He smiled, and my skin crawled in revulsion. The man was taking active enjoyment in her discomfort. She muttered something.
Speak up. I don't think we can all hear you.
An abandoned apartment building, okay? The words burst out of her, and Camp smiled.
Ah, but it wasn't abandoned, was it? How many squatters, poor homeless, that don't get the luxuries of room and board and tuition because they aren't mages?
He kept twisting the knife. 5, she said, her hands clenched. But nothing happened to them. The fire didn't start. I watched, sensing her anger, embarrassment, and fear. The fire never took off. It just smoldered and smoked.
Yes, smoke. And a pitiful little fire. That's why you're here. Almost managed to earn a bachelor's. Short one semester, weren't you?
He kept asking questions that he knew the answers to.
So, while the judge let you off, saying you obviously didn't want to burn the building down, I mean, how else could a fire mage fail so badly? You lost your free ride and now you're here. A failed arsonist. All for a measly 5,000. You threw away your life for that. Why? Did you need to prove how stupid you were?
Claudia was crying now and refusing to look up, her arms defensively across her chest.
Well, what was the money for? You wanted to go party last year? Or was your current wardrobe not fancy enough for you?
He kept jabbing and poking, and even Dwayne was starting to look uncomfortable. Claudia erupted, launching herself out of her chair so she was close enough her hair would touch him. I needed the money, okay? I didn't have enough money to buy pads and tampons. Merlin, I didn't have enough to buy condoms or coffee. $5,000? That would have lasted me the rest of the year plus, until I got into the draft. It was enough to make sure I had more than ramen and tomato soup. I was just tired of being broke. Her words cut me like a whip, and I couldn't sit silent anymore. Enough. Point made. Don't be stupid, and she was lucky. Why don't we talk about how to report any money you make on a 1099, even if it wasn't declared by the person paying you? I spoke loudly enough that my voice cut above her shaking, panting, and the magic that I suspected was about to lash out didn't appear. Camp sneered at her, but he let her sit down.
Or maybe you can learn to manage money better. The government is generous.
I bit my tongue, hard, to prevent myself from saying something I probably would have regretted. Maybe. He turned and started lecturing on the rules. I knew most of them, so I spent my time watching as Claudia curled up and seethed with embarrassment. Dwayne had his smirk back, and Ben just acted confident. This whole thing made no sense, but what worried me more was how easily that could have been me.
Get started on the assignment this week. Which laws cover the behavior expected of a mage?
He dropped a bunch of the small books with the mage laws in them on each of our desks. I saw the others grab them, even Feng. The temptation to use telepathy had never been so great. Instead, I kept my mouth shut and watched as he grabbed the papers, flipping through them. I knew mine was the only one he'd probably read, and it didn't matter. Alexin and I had worked through what saved my ass and how we could both protect ourselves next time. Bridget hadn't even bothered to grab a book, and I kept waiting for Camp to attack her, but he didn't. Instead, he frowned and went through the papers again.
Neil,
he barked out.
Where's your paper? Bridget has an excuse as she wasn't here last class. You don't.
I don't know what I expected from Neil, but it wasn't a shrug.
I didn't do it. Why not?
Camp barked, a triumphant grin on his face. Neil flushed the first hint of color I'd seen on him.
I didn't do it.
I could see his hands gripping the top of the desk, going white at the knuckles. Where is Camp going with this? Is this a power trip? You can't get killed for not turning in a paper.
So, are you refusing to follow orders?
Oh, Merlin, that can get you killed. My mind raced, trying to think how to derail this, but I couldn't protect the world. I gritted my teeth and kept my mouth shut.
What? Too good to write a paper. Even Miss Special over there wrote one. I have to admit, she at least understands the ramifications of what she did. But you're too good to do that.
Camp had moved over and stared at Neil. The kid, and yes, he was young, maybe 19, flushed and tilted his head down.
No? Then tell me, why didn't you write a paper, emo boy?
The amount of contempt in his voice had me leaning forward, ready to attack. But I didn't know what to say or do.
Because I can't read!
Chapter 11, Section 2.20.32. Any mage under the influence of drugs, a psychotic break, or otherwise out of control and using magic in an uncontrolled manner is considered a clear and immediate danger. If others are at direct risk from their undisciplined magic use, immediate termination is authorized to prevent loss of life. The officer on scene will make the decision as to how to deal with a dangerous mage. Neil snarled, and I felt his magic casting out the all-too-familiar prickle of Murphy's luck. I stood up from my desk and snuffed it before it could hit Camp. That would give him way too much justification, even if Murphy was just annoying. Only luck meant he hadn't realized he wore it before. Last time I checked, an education was guaranteed to all mages. How did illiteracy slip through? I asked Camp, while trying to make sure Neil didn't cast anything else. Luckily, his lack of education meant that Murphy was the easiest, as it was pure intent, more so than any other spell beside luck. The random thought that casting Lady Luck might have been how people cast blessings on others flitted through my mind and disappeared. Camp actively sputtered.
He's lying! Everyone can read.
I didn't grace that with an answer, though my blood boiled at the idea that so many kids slipped through the system. Neil, can you read it all? Do the letters move for you? I tried to keep my voice kind, but I'm sure my frustration slipped out.
Why do you care? I'm just a dumb idiot.
He glared at Camp.
Just get rid of me. That's all anyone ever wanted anyhow.
I locked my jaw and glared at Camp. If he has dyslexia or there is some issue with his eyes, the government has a responsibility to make sure he can learn. Section 1.135.62. Camp's eyes narrowed, and we locked stares.
He refused.
He didn't know his rights. Do you want to throw away Mage because the education system failed him before he emerged? Camp's jaw ground as he stared at me.
1 chance,
he snapped out.
Otherwise, he isn't my problem.
I turned to Neil, and for the first time in my life, I was tempted by one of the lesser-known psychic spells, Persuade. I wanted to make him get a clue, but all I could do was present him with the option. Being an adult sucked. Neil, do you want to learn to read and go to college? Get a real job? I willed him to understand what was being offered, to get the one slim chance he had. He snorted and crossed his arms.
Why? To give more people a chance to pick on me and call me stupid? No one wants me. I can't learn to read. I'm too dumb.
Neil, I tried, but Camp cut me off.
He made his choice. This isn't your problem. Unless you're claiming mentorship status.
The smirk on his face told me he knew what that would mean. And what I only learned long after was how much Indira and Stephen had risked for me. I stood back and shook my head. No. I started to say something else, but his look had me snapping my mouth shut. Anything I did would make it worse. I longed to shake the boy, make him realize here was his chance. But he was so angry he couldn't see, and there was nothing I could legally do to make him realize it.
Fine. You willing to give up being a mage?
Camp positively glowed with delight.
What do you mean?
Neil said, his voice wary.
You're untrained and you're an idiot, but you aren't a criminal yet. Here's your one-time offer. Join the army. You'll serve a decade. They'll teach you what you need to know, but you will be prevented from using magic ever again.
How? The words burst out of me, and I cursed silently. I should have clamped a hand over my mouth, but I forced a smile and tried to pretend I hadn't just lost control. He smirked.
If you aren't trained and you don't know how to make offerings consistently, it is relatively easy to neuter a mage.
His attention snapped back to Neil.
Your head will be shaved and your nails cut to the quick every week. If you're caught doing magic for anything other than circumstances where your life or others are at risk, you will be executed as a rogue mage. But if you make it out after a decade, you'll be free.
Carelian snorted in my mind.
Like lack of hair or nails would stop you.
I didn't say anything. Camp wasn't wrong. Most mages only learned how to offer their genetic material via training and being taught how to isolate the cells. And after a decade of no magic and no easy offerings, he probably wouldn't even think about magic. It would be like most of the mages I'd met. After a while, it was easier to do things the normal way than use magic. Camp picked up his phone and made a call. I went back and sat down, eyes still on Neil. He sat there, looking sullen and angry, and I let it go. I couldn't save everyone. I kept telling myself that. Maybe I'd start to believe it.
Arrangement is made. Look on the bright side. They'll teach you what you need to know, and you're guaranteed a job for the next decade. It could easily be worse.
If he had been sarcastic, or even cruel about it, I might have lost my temper. But he wasn't. He sounded sincere. A true believer. In some ways, that was even more stressful. He might enjoy destroying us, but he did it because he believed we were dangerous. When it came to me, I couldn't blame him. I was dangerous, just not in the way he thought. 5 minutes later, Neil was gone with 2 men dressed in suits. I found it odd that it was mostly men driving this, but for all I knew, all the women were too damn intelligent to be caught up in this insanity. The end of class was another assignment to list out ways to stay within the letter of the law for Wandering Mage Act, and what the consequences would be if we didn't. This had been discussed to death in college, and writing a 1-page paper would only take me an hour at most. At least I had an e-reader, so I could read while I had nothing to do. It was a subdued class that headed toward lunch. We'd gone from 11 mages to 9. Maybe all of this was a draft version of Then There Were None. It sure felt that way. Bridget and I walked slowly. She was more interested in watching Carelian explore. I still didn't know what to do. We entered, and one of the servers was talking earnestly with Elizabeth. Everyone else had already gotten their trays and sat down. The food today seemed relatively safe. Taco salad. I grabbed a salad with extra salsa, and then grabbed a bowl of taco meat with sour cream for Carelian. The server started to say something, and Carelian just raised himself up on his hind feet, and the server's mouth clamped shut. I fought giggles as I headed to the table. Bridget took good care of herself, getting her own food and following me, but there wasn't any way I could see her making it through the high-level STEM education. Or maybe I was making an assumption. We settled down at a table, Carelian sitting in a chair to eat. I arched a brow at him, and he just flicked his ears at me. He was showing off. Bridget watched him eat, her eyes widening at his opposable thumbs. I wanted to ask Bridget a question, or lots of questions, but the bang of a plate hitting the floor jerked my attention to the side. Elizabeth was jerking backward in her chair, the plate laying discarded on the floor, with utensils scattered like fallen offerings. I jumped out of my chair and was headed toward her when she began to thrash, falling to the floor with her head thwacking it hard enough I winced reflexively. I had just made it to her side when hot water streaming into my face pushed me back. "Merlin, she's tripping and her magic is lashing out," I muttered. Often you could calm a tripping mage by touch, but the table caught on fire, and the water from the steam trays came shooting out, creating whips of boiling water. I couldn't get close.
"Want me to attack her?"
Carelian asked at my side, as everyone else had fled to the opposite side of the cafeteria, except Bridget, who sat at the table. She watched all of this with wide eyes, but didn't seem scared. "No, you might get hurt, and I'm not sure it would make any difference." I ducked as water lashed out at me. Elizabeth rose to her feet, laughing with a touch of hysteria. "I can see it! I can see how to use magic! You're all idiots!" The air went hot enough I backed up another step or two, then more water in the air, making it hot and almost like breathing steam. I coughed. "I have to stop her before she kills someone." KO was still easier if I was touching, but I could get a directed wave here. I heard people behind me yelling, but I focused on her. The KO went out in the smallest cone I could manage, an area about 3 feet wide and about 10 feet. The cop I'd seen cast one back in Rockway was still more skilled at it, but I could disable more people for longer now. I'd come a long way since the showdown outside my house in Albany. The wave hit her, and she looked at me for a split second as the magic collapsed. Then I saw her start to crumple. 2 cracks from a pistol shattered that weird calm. Her head exploded, brains shooting out the back of her skull, and her body fell dead to the floor. I pulled up my shield, magnetic energy swirling around me as I spun. Carelian had moved close to me so my shield would cover him too. Expecting a bullet to hit me any moment, I turned slowly and saw 2 of the suited men I'd seen standing there, guns drawn, looking at me, not Elizabeth's body on the floor.
"Are we going to have a problem with you, miss?"
one of them asked. They really did look like goons from a movie set. I dubbed one stocky, the other hefty, just so I could differentiate them in my mind. "Only if you keep pointing a gun at me, or my familiar. I am allowed to protect myself." I cast Lady Luck on myself, Carelian, and Bridget for good measure. They exchanged glances, and then one of them reached into a pocket with his left hand, pulling out a phone. A quick dial.
"Yes, sir. The target is down. There's another mage in between us and the target."
A moment of listening, then,
"Yes, that is her."
Silence.
"Yes, sir."
The goon hung up and put down his gun at the same time as he put the phone away.
"You are free to go, ma'am,"
he said, his voice dismissive. Lessons that I had taken to heart welled up as I fought to deal with what had just happened. That is Merlin Monroe, and I would like an explanation for what just happened. I replied, my shield still up. Hefty and Stocky exchanged glances, then looked back at me.
We are just following orders, Merlin Monroe. Mr. Camp will be here in a minute. Miss Elizabeth Duncan was determined to be a risk to others with uncontrolled magic due to drug use. This put her in violation of Section 2.20.32.
They both looked nervous and contemptuous at the same time. I wanted to scream. I turned around and looked at the splatter of brains, blood, and bone over the gray-yellow floor. Her face was all but unrecognizable. Even looking at the situation in hindsight, there wasn't much I could have done unless I hit her with a KO the second she started to convulse. Even then, it might not have worked. I swallowed and turned to look at them. At least 2 mages, Benjamin and Jake, were throwing up. The cafeteria servers had fled. There's nothing I can do. I failed. I made it 3 steps before Brian Camp stormed in. Chapter 12. Section 2.23.1. While in the course of their duties, a mage may find themselves needing to act in a manner that is against their moral or religious code. At all times, their oath of service must be weighed against their own morals, while sex, murder, or even assassination may be the best way to resolve assignments. No employee of the government can be punished for choosing another resolution.
Are you responsible for this, Monroe?
He shouted, storming over toward me. I cranked up the power of the shielding to the point that the hairs on my arm were rising up. He stopped a foot away from me, a frown on his face as his watch lifted up. Responsible for what? I looked at him, trying to keep my emotions in check. That wasn't easy, as I didn't know if I wanted to cry, rage, or worst of all, just walk away.
Her lashing out like that.
I stiffened as the pieces snapped into place. The server talking to her, the sudden reaction, and what the goons had said. Where the brain splashing hadn't affected me, the sudden realization of what he had done made nausea rise in my throat. You set it up. Your goons tripped your hand. You got her drugs. The server gave them to her and she OD'd. You knew she would. They knew she was out of control, even what law to use. And they were right here, when they haven't been present without you calling for them before this. He stared at me, then shrugged.
She didn't have to take them. That was her choice, not mine.
A quick glance around the room.
Looks like there is some damage to clean up.
But not as much as you had hoped. I wanted to spit, to cleanse out the foul taste in my mouth. He glanced at Bridget, then back at me and Carelian.
Collateral damage can't be helped.
Rage flashed through me, and I forced myself to turn. Appetite fled. I believe I have class this afternoon. My voice stayed mild as I walked over to Bridget. Are you ready to head to class, Bridget? Her eyes were locked on the figure on the floor. Is she dead? Yes. Carelian rubbed up against her leg, purring loud enough I'm sure people against the wall could hear him. Okay. She stood up and took her plate over to the return station. Bridget headed out the door without looking back. I shot Camp a hard look, and he just smirked. Screaming wouldn't solve anything. Right now, he had all the cards and all I could do was play the game. I hated playing games. Bridget stopped in the middle of one of the grassy areas, lifting her head to the sun. Pretty day. Her smile was the same sweet thing, and the image of her laying on the ground like Elizabeth flashed through my mind. There had to be something I could do. Anything. There was no answer from above, so I pointed at another building, one we hadn't been in yet that looked like the old gym. We go there next. Okay, she said with a smile, and started off in her rambling walk toward that building. I followed, my mind racing, and my shield held high. I only saw Yvette walking behind us, still in stilettos. Why anyone would wear those, especially when walking across grassy areas, I'd never understand. This was only the third day. At the rate mages were dropping, I'd be alone by the end of the week. What fresh danger did this class hold? I took the lead when Bridget hesitated. She traipsed after me, perfectly happy to have someone to follow. The door with a sign on it reading, Mage Draft Training, opened into a large practice area that reminded me of a dance studio. There were 10 chairs in the wide open space, and not much else. Bridget went in and drifted over to the mirrors, twirling in front of them. In the corner of the room was a small counter with cabinets above and below, and a basket of fruit sitting on the counter. The idea of going and grabbing an apple sounded appealing. Anything to get the smell of burned blood out of my nose. Maybe later, after I assessed the danger of this class. I sat near the end, leaving one chair open for Bridget. It didn't take long before the rest of the students came in. They sat down, leaving the empty chair between me and the rest of them. I couldn't get the image of Elizabeth out of my head, and more than one of the others looked green. 2 minutes went by with all of us sitting there, not talking, and I missed my phone. At least then I could have been chatting with Joe or Sable, or if nothing else, I could surf the net on it. Before my frustration could slip from my control, the door opened and a woman walked in. We all turned to look at her. She commanded our attention as she walked through the doorway and into the classroom. I could see most of the men reacting, but I'd been exposed to Indira and Esmir enough to sit back and analyze. She was only about 5'4", and not stunningly pretty, but as she moved through the room, she exuded power and confidence. The simple dark blue dress would have looked at home in the office or out for the night. What really caught my attention was the expression on her face. Simple confidence. Welcome to my class. All of you have been chosen to work in the shadows of the country. Your assignments will be dangerous, but you will have the chance to make a difference. Something many people never get. Here I will teach you the darker sides of your power. You will learn how to kill and investigate. If you have the temperament, you will learn how to tempt and kill. But most of all, you will learn to see into the dark side of reality and make it bright. I blinked, looking around. I saw the others were hanging on every word. I fought back a groan. We were expendable, and since we were problematic, why not throw us at a problem that might kill us? It solved 2 birds with 1 stone. You mean I'll be working on my back again? Nothing new there. Yvette smirked as she talked. Be just like my college days. Wait, you want me to be a prostitute? Claudia looked like she might hyperventilate. No, child, Yvette said in more of a drawl than I'd heard before. She's talking Mata Haris. Sounds fun to me. Always said sex was a weapon. You may call me Madame Verde. She rolled the R, making it exotic to my southern ears. I will be your guide. Her eyes roamed over all of us, snagging on Bridget, who was humming softly to herself as she sat on the floor, petting Carelian. Nothing flickered over her face. Instead, with the same confident smile, she turned back to us. As you can see, I am an entropy archmage. She moved her hair and revealed an entropy tattoo. I have decades of experience with mages of all branches, and I can make sure you use your powers to the fullest. She gave a cool smile that made my teeth ache, it was so cold. It was how Salistro would smile if she was human. That idea made me want to run very far away. First lesson is getting in shape. It is part of the reason they are starting you with PT here. If you aren't healthy, staying alive is harder. But we're mages, protested Dwayne, who had a horrified and fascinated look on his face. So? That means you're just as easy to kill as a human. Most of the skills I will teach you are variations of what you can do, and we will go over all of them. We will start with elements, as most of you have either fire, water, or air. Her eyes flicked to me, dismissed me, and touched on Bridget. That had me stiffening, but she didn't act like she was going to do anything, so I let myself relax, but kept the shield up. I'd lowered its power, but it was still there. How many of you did the boil water, freeze water, or blow paper around experiments? Everyone raised their hand, even Bridget, which told me she was paying more attention than I thought. Which meant what? This all sucked. You can eliminate targets with similar logic. If you can boil water, you can boil blood or the brain. If you can freeze water, you can freeze a joint, an eye, or a heart. This is more difficult without excellent knowledge of anatomy. But if you're just trying to kill, the brain is a large target that involves no specific knowledge.
Are you really teaching us how to be wetwork spies?
Jake burst out, looking like it was Christmas and Halloween rolled into one. That would imply there is a wetwork division, which there isn't. I will teach you how to use your skills to the best advantage for our country. Anything not cleared by your draft officer would, of course, never be tolerated. I wanted to open my mouth and tell them about the various laws, but instead, I kept my mouth shut as I thought. They couldn't force me to do this, and I knew that. Did I tell the others? Trying to be subtle, I turned and looked at the other students. Claudia still looked vaguely horrified, and I suspected the Wicca leaning made it so the idea of killing someone, especially when she couldn't do it with fire from a distance, horrified her. Jake, Ben, Dwayne, and Yvette all looked almost excited, as if being someone that would die in their first year of service was somehow something to look forward to. I leaned back, trying not to rage. She continued on, basically getting them to think outside the simple patterns that they would have learned in the classes they had taken. At least, I thought they'd all had basic magic classes. I knew Yvette had her bachelor's, and I assumed Dwayne and Ben did, but who knew? A cart was wheeled in by the goon Hefty. It had a bunch of glass bottles on it, and all filled with different substances. For fire and water, I want you to come up and practice boiling and freezing. For those of you with air, I have these. As she spoke, she walked to the cupboards I'd seen earlier. Opening the top one, she pulled out a basket and walked back. These are excellent items to start with. She pulled out a handful of tiny origami paper cranes. I want you to fly them to random points in the room. The more swiftly and accurate you can do it, the better. Then, we will get to smaller and smaller items. Her smile had that same level of chill as she pulled out cranes that were even tinier. You'd be amazed at what people ignore. The rest of the mages seemed excited and bubbled up to go look at what she had. Claudia even looked curious, the green fading from her face. Fang just moved like a tin man, all stiff and unemotional. Bridget didn't. She just made faces in the mirror at herself and Carelian. Miss Monroe, are you going to join us? Madame Verde asked, her voice pleasant yet disinterested. I smiled at her. I am afraid I don't have any of those skill sets, and it is Merlin Monroe. My voice just as pleasant. Oh, I had heard you were rather skilled at fire. Butter would not have melted in her mouth. Her tone was cool. I'm afraid you have me mixed up with someone else. I pointed at my tattoo, clearly visible as my hair was in a French braid. No fire. In fact, earth is the only element I have. Ah, I must have been mistaken. She adopted a thoughtful look. I looked away as if I didn't care about her and watched the mages. Too many of them were paying attention to us, but they were at the same time busy boiling liquids, freezing them, and making the little cranes fly around. Yvette had a smile, the first real one I'd seen, as she zoomed the cranes to different parts of the room. Jake came over to us, his eyes locked on Madame Verde's breastline.
I don't have any elements either. What should I do?
Verde turned and smiled at Jake. Marilyn Monroe and I were just discussing that. She made a show of peering at his tattoo. He was psychic, with non-organic and relativity. It vaguely disturbed me that he had so many of the same skills I did, and he qualified as a first-class creep. Relativity is an interesting skill set, but as always, psychic is the power with the best offensive skill. You are an archmage? She directed that to Jake, who puffed up and managed to get his eyes off her chest for a moment.
No, a magician,
he admitted. I gave him points for not lying. Ah. She deflated slightly, and I wanted to roll my eyes. Indira had spent a lot of time with me on how honeypot crafting went and why it worked so well. It also turned out I was largely immune, as was Charles, because neither of us was attracted to bodies. It made sitting back and watching people be stupid rather amusing. Then I'll have to teach you both how to use KO. I swear Jake's eyes lit up.
Yes,
he hissed out.
That would be wonderful.
My skin crawled as I watched him get aroused. Stephen Alexant was becoming a nicer and nicer man the longer I was around some of these creeps. Remember, touching someone sexually if they are unconscious is non-consensual and can be regarded as rape. He looked at me, and I smiled, showing all my teeth.
I know,
he muttered, and took a step away from me. Do you know how to use KO? Madame Verde looked at me, waiting. Yes. I didn't bother to hide it. I was sure that had been recorded. Excellent. Show me, please. Her face remained absolutely smooth, but a glitter in her eyes set my alarms off.
Corey,
Carelian warned. He still was over with Bridget, but I could feel the weight of his regard. I know. I tilted my head toward Jake. On him?
What?
He squawked, taking 3 rapid stutter steps back.
Not me.
No, I meant me. Her smile serene, and I saw the trap. Ah, then is this an official duel? What? That surprised her. A duel, according to Section 2.45.1. Oh, yes. I suppose that would be acceptable. Her excitement had died, and I wanted to laugh. If I had KO'd her, it would have been a witnessed attack, and I would be at risk. I raised my voice. Duel accepted. Witnessed? A chorus of voices, ranging from excited to annoyed, rang out. Witnessed. Chapter 13. Section 2.45.1. In certain situations, differences between mages cannot be settled equitably, or the measure of a mage may need to be taken in situations where simple tests are not as informative. In these cases, or when an instructor needs to assess a student, a duel may be an option. While killing blows should be avoided, they may occur. This is counted as an unfortunate accident, not a crime. Only experienced mages should duel, and duels between students or mages in the draft should be avoided if at all possible. Matching ranking is also recommended. You have the memory? I sent to Carelian.
Yes. May I eat her after you kill her?
First, I'm not going to kill her. I rose from my chair and moved to one end of the room. Second, ew. Really, I don't think humans taste as good as you think they do.
Meat is meat. Hot sauce solves everything.
I glared at him, but couldn't come up with a valid rebuttal. Taking the simpler path, I turned to Verde, who stood at the other end of the room. The others had pushed the cart over to the side and stood watching, with a bloodlust I recognized from the other realm all too well. Why do people want to see me in the middle of a fight? Her smile mocked me, and I sighed. Esmir and Bainral had made me practice and offer until I'd lost a full 6 inches of hair. But at the same time, I didn't want the draft aware of what I was capable of. But again, I only had earth as one of my elements. Though I could use my null branches, It was best if I never showed that off unless I was about to die. I stood there frozen as to what to do when I felt her call fire. I expected to see a fireball head in my way, or maybe a stream of fire. Instead, the area around me started to get very cold. I cast Disrupt at her, and the air warmed up as she rocked back a bit. Her eyes narrowed, and I saw her dark brown eyes glimmer. She responded in kind, hitting me with a much harder Disrupt than I used, and I had to use my biokinetic skills to brush it off. That skill was one I'd been working on. In the relativity branch, biokinetics gave me advantages if I paid attention to my body. I could tell she was getting ready to hit me with more fire. The elements were babbling with excitement. This needed to end before it got too involved, and people started asking exactly what I was doing. Much of what I did was almost invisible, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. But big and splashy made more sense in duels, which is why I found them kind of stupid. The power in the classroom let me call electricity, and I let some of my hair go in offering. Not a lot. Even my pales and non-organic were more than most people's strong branches. I shot a bolt of electricity toward her, but didn't have it follow her when she sidestepped. It ground out, hitting the floor. Impressive. I didn't know you could throw electricity. She didn't sound impressed. She sounded annoyed. Maybe something that wasn't in the file. A simple trick, much like this. I cast Murphy on her and pulled Lady to me. I could see her trying to figure out what I did, but I wasn't going to enlighten her. Instead, I hit her with a burst of terror I'd felt when Joe and Sable had disappeared. That got a reaction from her. Verde sprang backwards, her eyes wide as she looked around, panting. While she was trying to recover, I followed up with a narrow beam KO. It slammed into her before she'd shaken off the emotions, and she crumpled to the ground. Whoa, that was too cool. Where did you learn that? Claudia was babbling, and Jake looked like he was about to have a meltdown standing there. The others just looked wary, except for Feng. His eyes were narrowed as he stared at me. I walked over to Verde. Madame Verde, are you okay? Her eyes popped open, and the first real expression I'd seen on her flicked across her face, a snarl of rage. Then I felt her grab entropy and throw age at me. A growl slipped out, and I hit her with another, more powerful disrupt. While she wasn't powerful enough to age me, she could age some of my cells, and that would both cause damage and hurt. The disrupt hit her, and the magic fizzled out. Don't be stupid again. You know darn well using age or disease is frowned upon in duels. I managed to not snap out the words, but I stepped back, ready to react if she tried something else. I dislike losing, she said as she stood up, and this time fire flew at me. Earth sprang to accept my offering, and a wall of dirt, there was always dirt everywhere, appeared between the fire and me. The fire hit it and dispersed across the earthen shield. I pulled the dirt together into a ball in my hand and mentally asked Earth to send it to her as hard as it could. It hit her at chest level and exploded over her, knocking her to the floor. Dirt covered her dress and face, caking into the lines on her face and aging her visually.
What is going on here, Monroe? I'll have you executed for attacking an instructor.
I heard Camp's voice and sighed, trying to look at him. He was standing behind the others, rage and calculation clear on his face. I wasn't attacking an instructor. I dusted off my slacks. It was a duel to test my skills.
Is she telling the truth? Was this a duel, or did she just attack the instructor?
The way he weighted the words told me he wanted people to say no. Carelian brushed up against me. Verde managed to pull herself up, looking like she'd been playing in the dust. It destroyed any level of elegance to her appearance. Verde glared at me, but Bridget spoke first. Dual witnessed and agreed, per section 2.45.1. Her voice guileless. The other mages glanced at each other.
Yeah, we witnessed it. Was very outré. Not sure of everything that was cast," Benjamin provided, shrugging at the glares.
Camp's jaw clenched hard enough I was about to offer up the names of dentists. He stared at Verde.
"Is there an issue here?"
He glanced around the classroom, a sneer on his face.
"You don't seem to be teaching them much."
Verde blinked at him, her eyes narrowing.
"Oh, I think they are learning more than you would think. Now, if you don't mind, Merlin Monroe here provided excellent examples of KO and disrupt. There are other students who would benefit from learning how to use it so accurately."
Camp glared at all of us one more time, then stomped out, his annoyance palpable. Great. I win, and I just make more enemies. The glare from Verde at showing her up, not only in front of students, but Camp too, promised retribution. I sat down hard into one of the chairs and watched the students. Claudia and Jake were gazing at me in a way that was almost sexual, and my skin crawled. Feng seemed to ignore me, but he was also angled toward me. Yvette just focused on her crane. Dwayne and Ben seemed to be ignoring everyone, though the green tinge had left their expressions. So, now that you've made them realize how easy it is to kill people, are you also going to tell them the consequences if they attempt to do this to anyone? Verde sent me an arch look. She was trying to dust the dirt off herself.
The same consequences there are if you attack anyone. But if you're going to kill, do it right the first time.
Because watching the blood boil in someone's body is so much more pleasant than seeing someone's brains blown out and splattered all over the wall. My tone was hard and struck like a slap, and I heard Claudia start to gag as I pulled back into the forefront of their minds the image of Elizabeth laying there. Verde shrugged.
If you're stupid, you'll die. Better you die now than when you could hurt other people.
I tilted my head in acknowledgement, even if I would have preferred to burn her hair off. Why was I always getting in these situations? I took morbid enjoyment in the Murphy's cloak still settled on her. If she didn't notice it, oh well, not my problem.
She isn't wrong. While I might be opening your minds to what you can do with your powers while you work for the draft, don't think this is in any way permission to kill. The draft board and most other governments look down on mages killing, for any reasons.
The words sounded like they were pulled out of her.
But you still need to learn this.
She cast me a cold look.
There are some apples over there. Why don't you work on aging?
It wasn't a suggestion. Affecting nonchalance, I walked over to the cabinets and picked up the apple. A whisper of thought. The apple decayed in my hand, withering so fast that the bacteria didn't have a chance to reproduce. Instead, I had a desiccated apple. How much offering would it take me to age a person 20 years? The answer whispered in my mind, and I swallowed. Something like that should have cost me dearly. Instead, it would be half an inch along the bottom of my hair. The knowledge of what I could do for so little made me want to throw up. Where the brains hadn't upset me, this did. No one should have that level of power. What was worse was knowing how easy it would be to just age the heart. Not even the valves like I was going to target a few years ago.
You are a powerful queen. You must never forget that.
Carelian whispered in my mind, and I turned to look at him. The joy from the other mages at learning how to freeze a cup of liquid in the center of a container, or boil a teaspoon of water at the bottom of the jar, chilled me. Those particular skills were deadly, if used correctly. Why does power have to mean the ability to kill? My frustration leaked out, but the laughter I received surprised me.
Corey, power doesn't mean killing. It means power. What you do with it is what defines you. You are a dragon. Be one.
His laughter took too long to fade, and I glared at him across the room. Bridget was playing with her hair, but it kept vaporizing. What is she doing? I felt the weight of everything on me.
Playing with Scene. She is trying to find her mom.
His voice had a note of sorrow to it. I fought a lump in my throat. Seeing let you look through buildings, through the very molecules of the world, but you had to know what you were looking for and how deep to see. Otherwise, you might see the bones in your arm when you meant to see the veins, or the dirt in the ground when you were trying to see the bone. I could do it in theory, but it took a lot of offering, and you needed to know exactly how far to look. That sounded much easier than it was. My attention shifted back to Verde as she spoke. Everyone, please remember this. We will be working on branch-specific attacks tomorrow. There are ways to take out people quickly and easily. Anatomy will be the focus of tomorrow's class. I let it be. If finding her mom kept her happy, who was I to challenge that? Verde strode out of the classroom, trailing dust before anyone said anything. They were a quiet group as they gathered up the material and left. Feng veered off to one side, while everyone else headed to the dorm building.
1 minute,
Carelian whispered in my mind, before fading into the shadows. I frowned at his disappearance, but smiled at Bridget. I'm heading back to the dorms. You good?
Nap. I want a nap.
She smiled, and humming slightly, headed directly to the dorms with her swaying walk. I followed, watching her, but she didn't seem to be talking to anyone, and I let it go. She was functional enough to be alone and make it to her own room. Could she survive as a mage? Was I protecting someone that didn't need it?